The rulers of Iran, known as the Arsacids after Arsaces, the founder of their dynasty, or as Parthians after their first stronghold in Parthia, governed from at least 140 BC over a vast and diverse empire. Although their realm was not as extensive as that of the Achaemenids or the early Seleucids, it encompassed much of Iran and almost always Mesopotamia. Their authority stretched into Armenia and at times also into Syria and Asia Minor, which inevitably brought them into conflict with Rome. Despite these struggles, they generally held their ground against Western powers, as well as against nomadic incursions from the Saka in the northeast. After shaping Iranian history for nearly twice the length of the Achaemenid Empire, their rule came to an abrupt end in the early 3rd century AD, when Ardashir, an ambitious prince from Persis, challenged and defeated the last Parthian king, Artabanus. Like the earlier empire of Darius I, the Arsacid realm was home to a variety of languages. In Iran, Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, Chorasmian, and Bactrian were spoken, while in the west one encountered Armenian, different Caucasian tongues, and Babylonian. Aramaic remained widely used across Mesopotamia and other regions, and in Hellenistic cities such as Susa and Seleucia on the Tigris, Greek continued to flourish. The first 5 of these languages belong to what is called the Middle Iranian period, defined as the stage of Iranian languages written and recorded after the Achaemenids, but before the rise of Islam. 4 of them, Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, and Chorasmian, were written in scripts adapted from Aramaic, whereas Bactrian was recorded using a local form of the Greek alphabet. Aramaic scribes still acted as translators and editors, but over time, native speakers who had mastered Aramaic began using it alongside their mother tongues. This led to the development of new writing practices. Iranian texts at first were expressed almost entirely in Aramaic, but gradually Iranian words replaced many of them, leaving Aramaic as a set of conventional symbols, known as heterograms. For each Middle Iranian language, several regional varieties also existed. Parthian and Middle Persian are considered 2 Western Iranian dialects that eventually became literary languages. Parthian, originally the tongue of the old satrapy of Parthia, was adopted by the Arsacids as their court and administrative language. However, only a small number of texts in Parthian survive from their period. Since poetry and religious tradition were passed down orally, coins often bore Greek inscriptions, and the Parthian script relied heavily on Aramaic words. More substantial evidence comes from later centuries, in particular from Parthian versions of Sassanian royal inscriptions, and from the writings of the Manichaean community between the 3rd and 6th centuries in Parthia, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Middle Persian, which developed from Old Persian, was spoken from the 3rd century BC until the 8th or 9th century AD, and eventually gave rise to New Persian. Before the rise of the Sassanians, it was only a local dialect of Persis in southwestern Iran. But once they established power, it became the official and common language of their empire. From the Arsacid period itself, Middle Persian is preserved only in short coin inscriptions from the 2nd century BC. Most other surviving texts date from Sassanian times or later. Among the Eastern Iranian languages, Sogdian is especially notable, spread by the merchants of Samarkand along the Silk Road. Most of its surviving texts are from the Sassanian or post-Sassanian period, though a few coin legends survive from the 2nd century AD. In Chorasmia, located along the lower Oxus near the Aral Sea, the local language is known from short inscriptions on objects like vessels, bowls, coins, wood, and leather. In Bactria, Greek served as the administrative language under the Greco-Bactrian and early Kushan rulers, but it was later replaced by Bactrian, written in a local variant of the Greek alphabet, a change confirmed by both coins and numerous inscriptions. The empire was also home to many non-Iranian languages. Armenian, though only written down centuries later, is known indirectly through names and places recorded in parallel Greek sources. Close contact between Armenia and Iran ensured a heavy borrowing of Parthian words and names into Armenian. Greek culture and language also left their mark. The Parthian and Armenian courts absorbed Hellenistic customs, and kings placed Greek inscriptions on their coins. Greek texts from this period survive from Media, Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Susiana. Aramaic, which had once been the lingua franca of the Achaemenid Empire, became the common spoken language under the Arsacids. Its influence endured for centuries, shaping Middle Iranian scripts and being used in the writings of Babylonian Jews and Mandaeans. Babylonian, or Akkadian, was still said to be spoken in the 2nd century AD. Though cuneiform writing had already vanished, the last dated tablet being from AD 75. A striking example of this linguistic and cultural variety is Dura Europus, a city founded by Seleucus I, taken by the Romans in AD 165, and finally captured by the Sassanians in AD 256. In this single settlement, evidence survives of names and traditions from Greek, Latin, Babylonian, Palmyrene Aramaic, Nabatean Arabic, and Iranian sources, showing the extraordinary diversity that defined the Parthian world. To evaluate the written testimonies of the Parthian age in terms of their content and historical context, special attention must be given to the documents preserved on various materials. Among the most important are the clay sherds, or ostraca, discovered at the Arsacid centers of Nisa in Turkmenistan and Shahar-i-Kumis, the parchment records from Avroman in western Iran, and the parchment and papyri unearthed at Dura. At Nisa, the original Arsacid royal residence near modern Ashgabat, Soviet excavations uncovered more than 2,000 ostraca containing 2,758 texts from what seems to have been a record office. These documents, dating from the 1st century BC, mainly record deliveries of wine to the palace from vineyards belonging to estates, temples, or private individuals, and they often mention officials by name and title. They are best understood as provisional notes, probably intended to be copied later onto more permanent material, such as leather. A typical entry reads, "In this jar are 17 measures of wine from the Uzbari vineyard of the Friapatican estate, delivered through the satrap for the year 188 of the Parthian era, equivalent to 60 BC, brought by Humayak, a wine factor from Artastavanak." An additional note follows. "From the store, 2 measures and 2 kadas of wine added." This suggests that wine collected in the vicinity of Nisa was handed over as a form of taxation to the fortress of Mirdatkert, stored in jars, and later consumed, with occasional adjustments made to fill the containers. The so-called Avroman documents, discovered in 1913 in a grotto in the Ku-i-Salan mountains of Iranian Kurdistan, and now kept in the British Museum, consist of 2 Greek texts and 1 Parthian text on parchment. The Greek texts, dating from 87 and 21 BC, record the sale of half of a vineyard named Dadbakan in a place called Kopanis. The Parthian text, written in 53 AD, documents the sale of half of the vineyard Asmak, located beside Plowland, by Pataspak, son of Tiran from Bod, to Avil, son of Bashnan, and his brother for 65 drachmae. Because of the number of witnesses and the clear identification of those involved, these documents hold particular importance for historical research. Equally significant are the parchments and papyri from Dura. Among them, parchment number 10 records a loan agreement written in Greek in either 121 or 122 AD. This text not only preserves names and official titles, but also sheds light on the internal and external politics of the time. Two less important ostraca in Parthian script from Shari Kumis close this group of writings. Stone and bronze inscriptions also contribute valuable evidence. Two rock inscriptions in Parthian script and language from Kung-i-Naruzi in Khuzestan, dated to around 140 AD, identify figures on the relief there as Mithridates, king of kings, and Kabneshkir, governor of Susa. This is the first time that the famous Iranian royal title, King of Kings, is attested for the Arsacids. Two undated inscriptions at Sarai Pul Zuhab in southern Kurdistan, on the road between Kermanshah and Babylon, describe the investiture of a man by a king named Gotarzes, whose exact identity remains uncertain. Another notable monument is the stele from 215 AD, commemorating the satrap Kavasak of Susa, which depicts King Artabanus IV handing him the ring of authority. Aramaic inscriptions also appear, particularly on the reliefs of Elames, and additional records are preserved from Assur and Hatra, the flourishing caravan city of northern Mesopotamia. At Hatra, an Arab dynasty allied to the Parthians inflicted serious defeats on the Roman emperors Trajan and Septimius Severus. Later, after transferring allegiance to Rome, the dynasty itself fell to the Sassanians. Greek inscriptions also survive from the period, including one above a relief at Bisutun, showing Mithridates II being honored by 4 dignitaries, alongside an equestrian figure identified as Gotarzes. From Susa comes one of the most striking Greek inscriptions of the Parthian age, a stone copy of a letter from 21 AD in which King Artabanus II addressed the local archons, Antiochus and Phraates, confirming a disputed municipal election conducted along Greek civic lines. This text proves that Seleucia on the Iulius, or Susa, remained under royal authority just as it had in the Seleucid period. Of special recent interest is a Greco-Parthian bilingual inscription on the thighs of a small statue of Hercules found at Seleucia on the Tigris. The Greek version reads, "In the year 462 of the Greeks, corresponding to 151 AD, King of Kings Arsaces Vologeses, son of King Mithridates, campaigned against Messene and against King Mithridates, son of Pacorus, who had ruled previously. He expelled Mithridates from Messene, gained control of the region, and set up this bronze statue of Heracles, brought from Messene in the Temple of Apollo, who sits before the bronze gate." This inscription confirms that although the Arsacids managed to push the Romans out of northern and central Mesopotamia after Trajan's eastern campaign and the subsequent agreements with Hadrian, they had not fully secured Messene until the victory of Vologeses IV. The erection of the statue in Seleucia celebrated the restored unity of the empire. The last known Akkadian cuneiform documents also belong to this era. Administrative texts from Babylon, focused mostly on the Temple of Marduk, survive as late as 92 BC, while chronicles, astronomical records, and horoscopes continue until 75 AD. These Babylonian records mention Parthian office holders, such as the city prefect, along with temple officials and members of the Council of the Marduk Sanctuary, who also acted as the city's supreme civil authority. Dated cuneiform tablets provide important information on the struggle between the Seleucids and the Parthians for control of Babylonia. The region fell under Parthian rule from July 141 BC until 131 BC, when it was briefly recovered by Antiochus VII, only to be retaken by the Arsacids in 128 BC. It then briefly fell to Hispaeocines of Messene before becoming securely Parthian from 126 BC onward. The turmoil of these years, reflected in the records, has often been linked to the decline of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia and the abandonment of its temples. Yet a Parthian period text proves that as late as 108 BC, the sanctuaries of Bit-Resh and Irigal were still functioning, and that their revenues were being leased or sold. Ongoing excavations and the discovery of new archives promise further insights into Parthian administration in Mesopotamia. A particularly curious category of texts from the Seleucid-Parthian transition are the so-called Greco-Babyloniaca, 16 fragments of clay tablets bearing Akkadian or Sumerian texts written in the Greek alphabet. Debate continues over who ordered them, who wrote them, and what purpose they served. We now turn to the western regions of the empire, particularly Media, where the Parthian rulers chose to leave their mark at the same site once used by Darius I, the great monument of Bisutun. It is uncertain whether the Arsacids truly understood the historical weight of the Achaemenid inscriptions and rock relief carved there, for already in the 4th century BC, the historian Ctesias had mistakenly attributed the monument, as well as a nearby royal garden, to the legendary queen Semiramis. Still, the Parthians were fully aware of the sacred aura of the site, just as the Seleucids had been before them. In 148 BC, a Greek named Hyacinthus, son of Pantaucus, commissioned a relief of Heracles there on behalf of the Seleucid governor Cleomenes. Later, Parthian rulers such as Mithridates II and Gotarzes added their own reliefs and inscriptions at Bisutun, and another carving on a separate rock shows a king, probably Vologeses, offering sacrifice at an altar with attendants beside him. Media, with its capital at Ecbatana, clearly held an important place in the Parthian realm, as further shown by reliefs at Sarai Pul Zuhab and the discovery of Parthian settlements and cemeteries in the area. The same holds true for the southwestern regions of Iran. At Susa, and especially in Elimai, within the Bakhtiari Mountains, numerous traces of Parthian presence have been uncovered. The rock carvings of Elimai are particularly striking, many bearing Aramaic inscriptions. The reliefs at Tangi Sarvak, for instance, portray royal themes such as investiture ceremonies, hunting scenes, demonstrations of loyalty by local nobles, and displays of endurance in combat. Scholars still debate their dating, but their artistic style clearly bridges the traditions of the Achaemenids and the Sassanians. Yet it is also clear that Elymais, even under Parthian dominance, retained a strong measure of cultural and political independence. The local rulers presented themselves in these reliefs without reference to their Arsacid overlords, and the imagery often differs from Parthian art found in Mesopotamia. For this reason, the works are often described as a unique blend of Parthian and Elymaian traditions. When studying Parthian art more broadly, one notices that much of the surviving material comes not from the empire's main centers, but from its peripheries. Important finds come from Elimai, from Mesopotamian sites like Hatra, and even from border regions beyond Parthian control, such as Dura, Palmyra, and Commagene. In contrast, Iranian sites like Nisa and Bisutun reveal heavy Greco-Hellenistic influence, though often reinterpreted in original ways. Despite this diversity, historians still use the term Parthian art to describe artistic developments between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century AD across the vast area stretching from the Syrian desert to Central Asia. Shared stylistic traits help to unify this category, the most notable being the preference for frontal representation of figures. Artists also emphasized rich detail, particularly in the depiction of Parthian costume and jewelry. The origins of frontal portraiture remain a matter of debate, with different scholars crediting Greece, Iranian nomads, or the artistic traditions of Syria and Mesopotamia. The finest examples of Parthian art are found at Hatra in northern Mesopotamia. This city is famous for its monumental avens, large halls roofed with barrel vaults, square in plan and open on one side, as well as for its sculpted decorations, stucco ornaments, and an abundance of stone statues. Since Hatra lies outside Iran itself, one of the most notable Parthian artworks discovered within Iranian territory is the bronze statue of a nobleman from Shami in the Zagros Mountains. This life-sized figure, preserved almost in its entirety apart from the missing arms, is striking in its craftsmanship. The separately cast head shows a young man with a firm, expressionless face, wearing a mustache and whiskers, his hair brushed outward and held by a band. His attire is richly detailed, a cross-fronted tunic exposing part of his chest, a belt, wide trousers, and a torque around his neck, with 2 polished daggers at his side. These features suggest he was an aristocrat, possibly of Elymaian origin, but the generalized style makes the figure seem more like an idealized type than a specific individual. The impression of authority and composure it conveys must have been powerful. It is no wonder that Augustus, after securing his diplomatic triumph over the Parthians in 20 BC, sought to undermine such images of power with his own propaganda, filling the Roman world with statues of defeated barbarians, humbly kneeling or bearing heavy burdens as symbols of subjugation. The coinage of the Arsacid dynasty offers another important glimpse into their identity and political messaging. Introduced in the mid-3rd century BC, Parthian coin issues were produced mainly in Ecbatana and Seleucia on the Tigris. Silver was the dominant metal, while copper served for local circulation, and unlike their Hellenistic predecessors, the Parthians never struck coins in gold. The standard denomination was the silver drachma of about 4 grams, supplemented by larger tetradrachms, though the latter, while based on Hellenistic models, Parthian coin designs reveal distinct Iranian elements. The obverse typically bore the king's portrait, early rulers shown with the soft cap of the steppe warrior, later kings with either the Greek-style diadem or the Iranian royal tiara. The reverse of the drachma generally depicted Arsaces, the dynasty's founder, seated on the omphalos, or later enthroned like Zeus. The tetradrachms might show the ruler on a throne holding a bow, depicted as bearer of victory, or mounted on horseback, while copper coins offered more variety in their imagery. Greek inscriptions were normally placed on the reverse, arranged in a square pattern, and from the 1st century AD onward, they were often poorly copied, eventually joined by Parthian inscriptions. These texts always invoked the dynastic founder's name, Arsaces, and typically styled the ruler as Great King or King of Kings, adding epithets like beneficent, just, illustrious, or friend of the Greeks. Though these titles began as deliberate political claims, they later became formulaic. Since the ruler's personal name rarely appeared except in cases of rival claimants, identifying the king on a given coin can often be challenging. vassal states within the Parthian sphere, such as Persis, Elymais, and Kerosene, also minted their own coins, usually modeled closely on Arsacid issues. By the end of the 1st century BC, Arsacid coins began to be overstruck in eastern Iran, especially in Sistan, an indication of the presence of local dynasties connected with the Suren family, one of the great Parthian noble houses. Our knowledge of the beginnings of the Arsacid rule is limited, relying mainly on later Western accounts. Writers such as Strabo, Justin, and Arrian were fascinated by how a dynasty that started from such small beginnings managed to grow into a powerful rival of Rome. Strabo explained that during the internal conflict between the Seleucid brothers Seleucus II and Antiochus Hierax around 240 BC, Arsaces, a Scythian leader, together with a band of Parni nomads from the Dahai, invaded Parthia and seized it. At first, Arsaces was weak and constantly at war with those he had dispossessed, but over time he and his successors expanded steadily through their military success. By conquering neighboring lands, they eventually established themselves as rulers of all the territory east of the Euphrates. Strabo noted that they controlled so many peoples and such a vast realm that they had become, in their own way, equals of Rome. He believed this strength came from their way of life and customs, which were partly Scythian and rough, but well-suited to maintaining dominance and success in war. Justin described the same unstoppable rise of the Parthians, though he gave more detail about their earliest years. He said the Parthians were originally Scythians, driven from their homeland by internal strife. They settled quietly in the barren region between Hyrcania and the surrounding tribes. At first, their neighbors tolerated them, but when resistance came later, the newcomers were already strong enough to expand further. They spread into both wide plains and mountainous terrain, enduring climates of either intense heat or heavy snow. Around the same time, Theodotus of Bactria declared himself king, and other eastern nations also began breaking away from Macedonian control. It was in this turbulent period that Arsaces appeared, a man of uncertain background but great energy, who had once lived by raiding and robbery. When he heard that Seleucus had suffered defeat in Asia, he took advantage of the situation, invaded Parthian territory with his followers, overthrew their prefect Andragoras, and made himself leader. Soon after, he also captured Hyrcania. With 2 peoples under his authority, he raised a strong army, both to guard against Seleucus and against the Bactrian king. But the death of Theodotus removed one threat, and Arsaces secured peace with his successor. He later defeated Seleucus himself, and that day was celebrated by the Parthians ever after as the birth of their freedom. With Seleucus forced to withdraw, Arsaces was able to reorganize his realm, recruit soldiers, fortify cities, and even found a new city called Dara, considered both secure and beautiful. Because of these achievements, he came to be remembered by the Parthians as their founding figure, just as Cyrus was for the Persians, Alexander for the Macedonians, or Romulus for the Romans. After his long reign, he was honored so greatly that every Parthian king from then on bore his name. Arrian, however, presented a different version. In his account, which survives only in later adaptations, Arsaces and his brother Tiridates, together with a group of conspirators, killed the Seleucid-appointed governor of Parthia in revenge for an insult. The figure of Tiridates is doubtful, but this version shows how stories about the dynasty's origins diverged. Archaeological evidence places the early Parthian centers further north, around Nisa near Ashkabad, Dara near Merv, and Asak, where Arsacid was crowned. The official Parthian era begins in 247 BC, marking the rise of the Parni, even though the actual break with the Seleucids happened a few years later. After the retreat of Seleucus II, the Parthians briefly occupied areas south of the Elburz Mountains, but lost them again to Antiochus III, appearing then as vassals. Only later, under Phraates I and his successors, did they expand firmly into those southern territories, with Hecatopolis and its region finally secured by Mithridates I. The legends that grew around Arsacid were shaped by long-standing Iranian traditions. When Justin compared him to Cyrus, the connection was deliberate. Both were said to have risen from humble beginnings and lives marked by raiding or outlawry before establishing great empires. Such stories emphasized not only the military genius of these founders, but also the idea that they would remain hardened by their origins, unspoiled by luxury. Honoring the founder by giving all kings his name reinforced that tradition. Iranian tales of empire builders often linked them to earlier dynasties as well. Cyrus was said to be connected to the Median royal line, while Sassan of the later dynasty was tied to older Persian rulers. In the same way, some accounts linked Arsaces to the Achaemenids. One tradition even named Artaxerxes as his ancestor, a detail that may have been drawn from older stories about the Achaemenid king, who before taking the throne was called Arsaces, or a variation of that name. This connection provided the new dynasty with legitimacy, tying them symbolically to the great Persian rulers of the past. Arrian's account also connects the Parthians with earlier Iranian kings. He relates that Arsaces and Tiridates removed the Seleucid satrap with the aid of 5 companions. The fact that there were 7 conspirators in total mirrors the story of Darius and his 6 allies in the slaying of Gaumata. This parallel was likely intentional, giving the event an Iranian national character. A similar tale is recorded about Mithridates I of Pontus in his revolt against Antigonus. It is clear that the Parthians themselves shaped this tradition of descent and legacy. Alongside Arrian's reference, evidence can be seen in names such as Artaxerxes, found on an ostracon from Nisa in 92 BC, in the use of Achaemenid royal titles, and in reports by the scholar Biruni that the local petty kings of Iran, who rose after Alexander's conquest, held the Arsacids in esteem for claiming descent from the old Persian royal line. The effort to secure recognition of their sovereignty led the Parthians to present themselves as heirs of the Achaemenids, with Parthia itself recast as their ancestral homeland. Mithridates I, the first ruler to bear the title King of Kings, played a decisive role in shaping this tradition. His reign marked the transformation of Parthian authority from regional rule into dominion over a vast empire, which required the legitimacy of historical continuity. The Arsacids continued to cultivate this claim. In 35 AD, Artabanus II reclaimed Persian lands from Rome, and, as Tacitus records, spoke with pride and menace of the ancient boundaries of both the Persian and Macedonian empires, declaring his intention to recover the territories once ruled by Cyrus and later by Alexander. By invoking Alexander, he not only tied himself to the Achaemenids, but also presented himself as the rightful heir to the Seleucid kings. This naturally raises the question of the Parthians' relationship with Greek culture. It is not the case that they adopted Hellenism merely because they lacked traditions of their own. Nor can their embrace of Greek ways be explained solely as a political strategy to keep Greek subjects loyal. Their openness to Greek culture appears genuine. A famous scene described by Plutarch illustrates this vividly. After the Parthian victory over Crassus in 53 BC, King Orodes made peace with the Armenian king Artavasdes and arranged a marriage between their families. At the celebrations, Greek literary works were performed. Orodes was well versed in Greek, and Artavasdes himself composed tragedies, speeches, and histories. During the feast, the severed head of Crassus was brought in, and at that very moment, a tragic actor named Jason was performing lines from Euripides' Bacchae. He incorporated the head into the performance, turning the moment into a macabre display of Greek drama, and this so-called Philhellenism, however, was never unconditional. The guiding principle of the Arsacid rulers was self-interest. Over time, especially during the last 2 centuries of their rule, their policies increasingly emphasized Iranian identity. This shift is seen in the introduction of Parthian inscriptions on coins, in the account that King Vologeses safeguarded the Avesta, and in their support for Iranian traditions. Yet by the late Parthian and early Sassanian periods, much precise knowledge of the Achaemenids and Alexander had faded. The loss can be explained by the predominance of oral culture in Iran. Popular tales, especially the epics of the Eastern Iranian Khayanid dynasty and their wars against the Turanians, were passed down through oral tradition and infused with Zoroastrian themes. During the Parthian age, these Eastern stories overshadowed local traditions of Media and Persis, leading to a gradual forgetting of the Achaemenid past, even though the great monuments of Persepolis and Nakshoy Rustam still stood in plain sight. At the same time, Parthian rulers and nobles were woven into this growing body of epic lore, celebrated for their deeds and victories. Their memory was preserved by the Gosen, court bards who sang and recited at feasts and funerals, acting as musicians, poets, and chroniclers of both the past and the present. When the Sassanians later sought to erase the Arsacids from collective memory, much of their history survived only in fragments of epic poetry, fused with other Iranian legends such as the heroic cycle of Rustam from Sistan. These elements together formed the foundation of a national history of Iran, compiled and written during the Sassanian age, which left a lasting mark on later Arabic and Persian literature. Echoes of Parthian storytelling traditions survive in works like Vis and Ramin, preserved as a Persian poem in the 11th century and as a Georgian prose version in the 12th. The origins of this tale clearly reach back to Parthian times. Often compared to Tristan and Isolde, it tells of the forbidden love between Ramin and Vis, who is married to his brother, King Mobad. Their passion brings guilt and sorrow, yet ultimately binds them together. Later, Persian versions describe the work as a masterpiece created by wise men, likened to a garden full of flowers, originally composed in Middle Persian, whose archaic style needed refining for new audiences. By reworking it into elegant language, poets ensured the story endured, polished like a precious jewel, carrying forward a fragment of Parthian cultural memory into the medieval world. Compared to the better documented periods of the Achaemenids and the Sassanians, our knowledge of social life in the Parthian realm is limited, particularly in the early years before the Parni established their great empire. Ancient writers tell us that the Parni moved into the Parthian lands of modern Turkmenistan out of necessity, and that they remained there partly because retreat was no longer possible. We cannot say with certainty whether they had been nomads moving with the seasons, or whether they were already settled herders and farmers. Classical authors described Parthia, especially the regions first seized, as barren and inhospitable. Yet this was clearly an exaggeration, likely intended to present the Parthian rise as extraordinary or to highlight the toughness of the Parni themselves. In fact, during the Achaemenid era, Parthia was already populous enough to resist a royal army under Hystaspes, father of Darius, and could only be subdued at heavy cost. Later, Arsaces founded the city of Dara in the Apavorton, a place known for its fertility and self-sufficiency, and the burial site of early kings. The fact that the Parthians built towns in areas such as Astuin, Parthian, and Apavorton was less a mark of unusual ability than a sign that the land already offered the right conditions. Archaeology in the region east of Ashgabat has revealed Bronze and Iron Age settlements whose prosperity was based on irrigation and fertile oases. Some modern scholars have connected these early communities and the emergence of a new culture to the arrival of Saka tribes, who blended with the local Iranian population while their leaders became an elite class that survived even under Achaemenid rule. If this interpretation is correct, then the Parni conquest may have followed a similar pattern, either by driving out the provincial nobility or merging with them, and by creating a new social mixture of natives and newcomers. To understand how the Parthian nobility related both to their own people and to the conquered Iranians, we can turn to two classical accounts. One is by Justin, who describes the administration and social order, and the other by Plutarch, who describes the Parthian army at the Battle of Carrhae. Justin explains that after breaking away from Macedonian rule, the Parthians were governed by kings, supported by a council of nobles from which both generals and leading officials were chosen. Their army, he claims, was made up largely of dependents described as slaves who remained in that status from birth and could not be freed. These men, however, were trained in horse riding and archery just as carefully as the free-born children of the aristocracy. The wealthier a noble was, the more mounted warriors he was obliged to provide for the king. Thus, when Antony marched against them, he faced 50,000 cavalry, of whom only 400 were free men. The difference, Justin adds, was that the dependents fought on foot, while the aristocrats fought on horseback. Plutarch, describing Surena, the Parthian general at Carrhae, paints a vivid picture. Surena was second only to the king in status, yet the foremost in courage and skill. He was striking in appearance and traveled with immense retinues, including 1,000 camels for baggage, 200 chariots for his concubines, and a personal guard of 1,000 armored horsemen, supported by many more lightly armed troops. In total, he commanded around 10,000 mounted retainers, many of them his own servants. His family had long enjoyed the honor of placing the crown on the king's head at coronations. Whether or not Justin's statement that dependents learned to ride yet fought only on foot is contradictory. What matters here is the clear existence of subordinate groups tied to the aristocracy. Plutarch calls them retainers and servants. Justin calls them slaves. But both describe men who were bound to the Parthian nobility. It is likely that the retainers were the native farming population, obliged to supply services or tribute to the Parni landowners, while the servants were more dependent serfs attached to the soil and inherited by the conquerors. This does not mean that ordinary chattel slavery did not exist. Other writers tell us of Parthian nobles owning personal slaves, and records mention prisoners of war being enslaved and sent away as booty. Future analysis of ostraca from Nisa may shed more light on the lives of these non-aristocratic groups. The sources also hint at divisions within the Parthian newcomers themselves. Ammianus Marcellinus and Tacitus both describe a split between the aristocracy, and the common people. In wartime, the latter fought as mounted archers, while the aristocrats rode into battle as armored cavalry. Within the aristocracy, the highest-ranking nobles enjoyed privileges based on their wealth, lineage, or special ties to the king. Roman authors described them as grandees or clan leaders. Among these prominent families were the Suren, Carin, and Gev, who retained their influence even into the Sassanian era. Earlier references to 7 noble conspirators against foreign governors also reflect the existence of such powerful clans. Unlike the Sassanian period, which left royal inscriptions describing the structure of the nobility, Parthian evidence is scarce. From later parallels, we know that aristocrats were divided into several ranks, ranging from great landholders and princes down to ordinary nobles. A parchment from Dura mentions a nobleman named Manesis, son of Phraates, who held military command in Mesopotamia and was listed among the free elite. Since the word noble could also mean free, it seems likely that the lowest rank of the aristocracy corresponded to this class of free-born warriors. The higher ranks probably included the clan leaders described as grandees. Even without a clear system of titles, it is evident that the Parthian court had a hierarchy influenced by Hellenistic traditions, and that distinctions of rank were visible both in war and in peace. Archaeological finds, such as the statue of the nobleman from Shami with his diadem, ornaments, and richly decorated clothing, illustrate the proud appearance and social position of the Parthian aristocracy. How should we picture the connection between the Parthian king and the nobility? From the beginning of Arsacid rule, a shift in power structure occurred. During the conquest of Parthia, when the security of new possessions was under threat, the role of a military commander-in-chief was transformed into that of a crowned king. Whether Arsaces had already held privileges that raised him above his fellow leaders before this moment is unclear. Yet the early authority of other Parni clans is reflected in the fact that the Suren family retained the right to crown the king, and that a council existed, described as appointing the ruler. This body included the king's close relatives from the nobility, wise men, and priests. Later conflicts between nobles and the royal line show that, although disputes were frequent, the principle that only the Arsacid family could provide kings was not seriously challenged. When King Phraopites IV died after 15 years, he left behind 2 sons, Mithridates and Phraates. Phraates, as the elder son, first succeeded to the throne and waged war successfully against the Mardi, but died soon after. Despite leaving several sons of his own, he chose to pass the crown to his brother Mithridates instead. This suggests that the king held the authority to name his successor, though in practice it was usually the eldest son who inherited. The nobility, through their council, would then confirm the new ruler. The need for formal recognition is clear in an episode recorded by Roman historians when Tiridates was about to assume sovereignty but delayed the ceremony at the request of leading satraps. While they postponed their arrival, the Surena placed the diadem on Tiridates' head before the assembled crowd, an act that caused divisions among other nobles who had refused to take part and later defected to his rival. It is not surprising that once the great conquests ceased, when king and aristocracy no longer shared common goals, the nobles, supported by their retainers, dared to intervene in disputes over succession. They sometimes sought aid from foreign powers, or even forced the deposition of reigning monarchs. Mithridates II, for example, was removed from power by the noble council after his campaign in Armenia, and his brother Orodes was placed on the throne. Yet to interpret such events as a shift from hereditary to elective kingship is misleading. nor is it right to view Parthian history as a steady decline, as some traditions later claimed of the Achaemenids. The Parthians still achieved great victories, such as their success in Messene, Artabanus's triumph against Rome, and the stubborn resistance of the Armenian Arsacids against the Sassanians. The balance of power in these struggles depended on the strength of particular rulers, their access to resources like mercenary troops, and the ambitions of rival clans, as well as the pressures of foreign affairs. The nobility itself was often divided by rivalries, so the Arsacid monarchy cannot simply be reduced to a patchwork of petty kings. How property rights or privileges were transferred between king, noble, and their dependents remains uncertain. The obligations and services owed by each group are also unclear, though they may have rested on personal allegiance sealed by oath. For this reason, terms like feudal system do not fit the Parthian world, and even the word vassal must be used cautiously. Within the empire's core territories, society was not only composed of nobles and peasants. There also existed a middle group of people whose specialized knowledge or skills made them indispensable in courts and noble households. These included artists, craftsmen, merchants, physicians, eunuchs, and entertainers such as minstrels. Among the conquered populations, the Greeks and Jews stand out as telling examples. After the Seleucids were expelled, Greek traditions endured in both cultural and institutional life. This is visible in Parthian coinage and in inscriptions across Mesopotamia and Iran. A Greek inscription from Babylon around 110 BC lists young men who had triumphed in athletic contests, showing that a Greek Macedonian community was still active there, with its own theater, agora, and gymnasium. Other inscriptions reveal the presence of Greek city-states at Susa and along the Sailu River. The major centers of Seleucia on the Tigris and Dura Europus also flourished under Parthian rule. Greek influence extended to intellectual life as well, with philosophers, geographers, and historians active in these cities. Greeks and Hellenized Babylonians even served Parthian officials, such as the messenger Zenon in Babylonia. Yet the Parthian attitude towards the Greek element was always shaped by self-interest. As long as the Greeks were useful, their communities were tolerated and even encouraged. But when they acted as a fifth column for foreign powers, as at Syrinx during Antiochus III's campaign, or in Babylonia after Phraates II's victory over Antiochus VII, the reaction was swift and violent. Two Greek cities deserve closer examination. In Susa, excavations reveal that the settlement underwent a remarkable period of expansion and building during Parthian rule. Alongside these architectural changes, the economic character of the city and its surrounding region shifted dramatically. Susa, once a hub of trade, increasingly became a center for agriculture, with the land around it being intensively cultivated. Greek inscriptions suggest that the local Greek elite were eager to promote farming as the foundation of their wealth, though they also show that the city had only limited independence under royal oversight. A different but equally revealing case is Seleucia on the Tigris, which, though technically outside Iran, provides a striking example of how Greek communities interacted with Parthian rulers. Tacitus offers a vivid description of Seleucia in the early 1st century AD. He notes that the city, still loyal to the memory of its founder Seleucus, preserved its Greek civic traditions rather than sinking into what he called barbarism. Its political life was centered on a senate of 300 men chosen for wealth or wisdom, balanced by the authority of the wider citizen body. When these two groups cooperated, the Parthians could be disregarded. When they fell into conflict, each faction turned to the king for help. only to find the monarch exploiting the division for his own advantage. This was seen under Artabanus, who sided with the aristocrats and weakened the common people, reminding Tacitus readers how fragile the distance was between minority rule and outright monarchy. Later, when Tiridates entered the city, he was received with the honors of ancient kings and with new forms of ceremonial splendor, while Artabanus was denounced as of low birth despite his Arsacid lineage. Tiridates briefly handed power to the popular faction, though his influence did not last. The struggle in Seleucia resembled the internal clashes of Greek city-states in earlier centuries, with aristocratic and democratic groups opposing each other. Rather than being a purely ethnic divide between Greeks and non-Greeks, it reflected civic politics familiar from the classical world. The popular faction backed Tiridates and managed to resist Artabanus until 42 AD, when his son, Vardanes, finally secured control. Even then, there is no firm evidence of the city's supposed Orientalization, either in material culture or coinage. What is clear, however, is that Parthian rulers often acted in their own interests. Artabanus had already curtailed municipal freedom by replacing local bronze coinage with royal issues in 2324 AD, and by abandoning the traditional title of Friend of the Greeks. At the same time, Jewish communities flourished under Parthian rule, particularly in cities like Nisibis and Nehardea in Mesopotamia. Although little is known about their intellectual life, these communities lived in relative security and enjoyed constructive relations with the dynasty. Their participation in the revolt against Trajan in 116 AD demonstrates their active role in the empire's political life. They were also heavily involved in the silk trade, supported by royal favor, which gave them considerable influence. By the 2nd century AD, a leader of Davidic descent, known as the Exilarch, represented the Jewish population at court and combined religious leadership with political responsibilities. After the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in Palestine in 135 AD, Jewish scholars fled to Mesopotamia, bringing with them the traditions of the Palestinian academies and strengthening the region's role as a center of Jewish life. Unlike the Seleucid and Sassanian eras, the Arsacid Empire remains poorly recorded when it comes to its administrative organization. We do not possess the kind of Western testimony that allows us to reconstruct Seleucid institutions, nor the wealth of seal inscriptions and bullae that illuminate Sassanian practices. As a result, the development of Parthian administration is very difficult to trace, and any attempt to identify changes over time is largely speculative. At best, we can compare the later Parthian period with the early Sassanian territorial divisions to guess at continuity. One of the few contemporary descriptions comes from Pliny the Elder, who wrote that the Parthians ruled over 18 kingdoms, divided between upper and lower regions, stretching from the Caspian shores to the Red Sea. These kingdoms appear to have been principalities under Parthian overlordship, where local dynasts styled themselves kings, but still recognized Arsacid supremacy. Among them were Persis, Elimes, Messene, Hatra, Osroene, Adiabene, Atropatene, and Hyrcania. Later inscriptions from Shapur Fuest of the Sassanian dynasty confirm the existence of other similar territories, such as Armenia, Sagan by the Black Sea, Balasagan to the west of the Caspian, as well as Kerman, Makran, Sistan, Marv, and Khwarezm. These entities had likely existed already under Parthian rule, though their leaders were eventually replaced by princes of the Sassanian house. In many regions, The Arsacids maintained earlier dynasties that had either served the Seleucids or asserted independence after their decline. So long as these rulers accepted Parthian authority, they were confirmed in their rights, such as striking coinage and enjoying other privileges. These petty kings often acted with relative autonomy. Some took sides in civil wars, like Izates of Adiabene, who supported Artabanus II, while others shifted allegiance to Rome, as the ruler of Messene did after Trajan's invasion. A few tried to establish full independence, yet they were still expected to supply troops when summoned. In sensitive provinces like Media and Armenia, Arsacid family members themselves were installed as kings after the reign of Mithridates II. To Roman observers, such as Pliny, the empire appeared more like a loose association of kingdoms than a centralized state, though this structure alone does not determine whether Parthia was weak or strong. Besides these client kingdoms, there were provinces ruled directly by the Arsacid king and governed by satraps or strategoi. In Mesopotamia, for instance, Tacitus mentions territorial prefectures, while Isidore of Charax records districts under their names, such as Choarine and Comacene. Inscriptions even attest to the title satrap of satraps, mirroring the royal claim to be king of kings. From the ostraca of Nisa, we hear of satraps, frontier wardens, fortress commanders, and other officials. At Dura, the title Hargbad appears, which has been interpreted as a chief tax collector or military governor. Powerful noble families also held immense estates, such as the Surin clan in Sistan and the Karin family in Mydia. Whether these holdings were subject to taxation is unknown. Our knowledge of agriculture during this period is equally limited, though excavations in Susiana indicate improvements in farming methods, including the cultivation of rice, which compensated for the city's decline as a trading hub by maintaining its importance as a regional market. Trade, however, is much better documented. The Parthians controlled major overland routes and acted as intermediaries between east and west. Roman merchants preferred the sea route to India and Arabia as it was cheaper, but overland exchanges through Mesopotamia and Iran never ceased. The famous Silk Road passed from Syria across Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau to Central Asia and China, while another mixed land and sea route connected Syria with Messene and then extended by sea to India. On this latter path, the merchants of Palmyra played a crucial role, transporting goods and maintaining caravans. Their prosperity depended on stable relations between Rome and Parthia, and both empires tolerated their activities for centuries, even erecting shrines in Parthian cities dedicated to Roman emperors. Inscriptions from Palmyra record tributes to merchants who worked in places like Spasinu Charax, Seleucia, Babylon, and Vologeses. Some traveled further to Bahrain, the Indus Delta, and India. The Romans bought spices such as pepper, perfumes, gems, and pearls, while they sold fabrics, silver, gold, and wine. India also served as a crossroads for Chinese silk, which reached the Mediterranean either by sea or via Parthian channels. From China came not only silk, but also steel, known as ceric iron, apricots, and peaches. In return, Parthia exported products like pomegranates, vines, lucerne, and especially the celebrated Nisaean horses of Media, highly prized in China as heavenly horses. The routes themselves are described in Isidore's account of the Parthian stations, which places Antioch and Zeugma on the Euphrates as the main western gateways. From there, travelers moved eastward through Seleucia, Ctesiphon, and Vologeses, across the Zagros Mountains by way of Bisutun, to Ecbatana, Ragai, the Caspian Gates, Hyrcania, Asak, Nisa, Merv, Herat, Sistan, and into Arachosia. Another road linked Damgan directly to Herat without passing north of the Kopet Dagh, though Isidore considered the route through the older Parthian centers more significant. This network of roads ensured that the Arsacid Empire remained a vital link in the long chain of commerce between Rome, Persia, India, and China. Our understanding of the Parthian army remains incomplete, relying mostly on scattered references in ancient texts, archaeological finds of weapons and armor, and depictions of warriors on reliefs and graffiti. The real strength of the Parthian military lay in its cavalry, which was divided into two main types: the heavily armored cataphracts and the lighter mounted archers. These forces were designed to complement each other in battle. The archers softened the enemy with relentless volleys of arrows, while the cataphracts, clad in full armor, delivered the decisive frontal charge once their opponents had been weakened. Infantry played a far less significant role, although there are reports, such as in a Syrian chronicle, of Parthian rulers sending large numbers of foot soldiers into combat. Mercenaries also held an important position, not only as part of the military machine, but as a political safeguard for the kings against the influence of the great landed nobles, since the core of the army was typically drawn from their retainers and dependents. The light cavalry wore tunics belted at the waist and wide trousers tucked into their boots, and their primary weapon was the composite bow. The armored horsemen, however, represented the elite. In this formation, both rider and horse were sheathed in protective mail or plate armor, with cuirasses that made them nearly invulnerable to lighter attacks. These warriors, later called clibanarii by the Romans, fought with long lances that were said to have such force they could impale two men in a single thrust. Roman armies often struggled against the tactics of the Parthians, most famously at Carrhae in 53 BC. There, the dazzling armor of the Parthian cavalry, glittering in the sun, stunned the Romans as the mounted archers unleashed arrows from massive, powerful bows. Supplies were constantly replenished from camels carrying endless reserves of missiles. When Roman cavalry tried to force close combat, they found themselves blocked by the armored horsemen, while the rest of the Parthian riders swirled around them in loose formations, stirring up blinding clouds of dust and continuing their deadly barrage. The Romans, crowded together and disoriented, fell in great numbers. Equally renowned was the tactic later known as the Parthian shot, in which horse archers loosed arrows behind them while feigning retreat. Parthian horses themselves were famed for their size, endurance, and beauty, and they played a central role in every aspect of life. It was said that the Parthians lived almost entirely on horseback, fighting, trading, feasting, and even holding conversations from the saddle. Although the Arsacid dynasty ruled over a diverse empire and tolerated many faiths, they seem to have maintained a connection with Zoroastrian traditions. Evidence from Nisa mentions fire priests and magi, and the Zoroastrian calendar was in use. Ancient writers also noted their funerary customs, which involved leaving corpses to be consumed by birds and dogs before the bones were finally covered with earth. One Parthian king, Vologeses, was even remembered for compiling the sacred texts of the Avesta, strengthening the link with the Zoroastrian faith. Other striking features of Parthian culture noted by outsiders included the perpetual sacred fire at Asak, and the practice of marriage between close kin. In terms of chronology, the Parthians developed their own reckoning of time, which began in the spring of 247 BC, sometimes used alongside the Seleucid era. For example, a royal letter from Artabanus II to the city of Susa gives the date according to both systems, while an inscription from the same region uses only the Arsacid calendar, naming the year, month, and day in the traditional Zoroastrian style. On 28 April 224, the Parthian king Artaban IV lost his life in battle against his rival Ardashir, an event that signaled the collapse of the Arsacid dynasty that had ruled Iran for nearly 5 centuries. The victors, the Sassanian house, had begun as local rulers in Istakhr near Persepolis and gradually extended their control since 205 by taking territory from smaller southern kings. In the following years, they gained possession of the Parthian domains and also extended their influence into northeastern Arabia. From the Arsacids, they inherited not only traditions of social, economic, and cultural life, but also the pressing political challenges of governing Iran and Mesopotamia. These included managing powerful neighbors to the west and east, such as the Romans and nomadic peoples, as well as the constant tension between royal power and the aristocracy. Despite severe crises, including civil war and defeat at Roman hands in the 3rd century, as well as disasters in the 5th century, such as losses against the Hephthalites, famine, and rebellion, the Sassanian monarchy endured for more than 400 years. The greatest moments of their rule came under Ardashir I, his son Shapur I, Shapur II in the 4th century, and Khosrow I in the 6th. Their deep impact on the shaping of Iranian national memory placed them alongside legendary rulers and heroic dynasties, remembered in the epics of Firdausi and Nizami, in Islamic chronicles, and in popular tales. For modern researchers, the Sassanians are particularly significant because their kings, especially in the early period, were eager to record their own ambitions through inscriptions, reliefs, palaces, fire temples, and coinage. These monuments survive in large numbers, while Christian and Manichaean observers, together with Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic historians, also described the Sassanian state. Some condemned it as a religious persecutor or a military foe, while others worked to connect its history to the broader narrative of salvation introduced by Islam. Yet the abundance of material should not tempt us to treat every fragment as if it could simply be fitted together to form a single image of Sassanian Iran. Such an approach would ignore historical change and the original motives behind each testimony. A better method is to classify the evidence according to when and where it was produced, the language used, and the cultural traditions it reflects. Among the most important primary sources are the royal inscriptions. These include the Rez Gestai of Shapur I carved on the Kaaba-i Zardusht at Naksh-i-Rustam near Persepolis, the inscription of King Narse at Paikuli, and the self-recorded career of the powerful priest Kirdir at Naksh-i-Rajab. These texts are invaluable for understanding the Sassanian court, since they name key officials and outline their roles. They also express a distinct vision of kingship, in which the ruler stands as mediator between the god Ormazd and his people. Moreover, they serve as royal declarations of achievements, challenging the versions preserved in Roman or Arabic accounts. At the same time, they are highly one-sided, reflecting the self-image the king wanted to project. Displayed in sacred locations beside the tombs of earlier Persian monarchs or on public monuments, they proclaimed the ruler's closeness to his ancestors and his divine right to rule, while copies, now lost, may have served as political propaganda abroad. Shapur's own words make this clear. He presented himself as a Mazda-worshipping god, king of kings of Iran and non-Iran, descended from divine ancestors, ruling an empire that included Persis, Parthia, Susiana, Mesopotamia, and many other provinces. He described the peoples relocated from Roman territory and settled across his domains, and he listed his victories and heroic deeds so that future generations would recognize the greatness of his reign. He ordered these deeds to be recorded at Naqsh-i-Rustam, on a structure built in the Achaemenid age, close to the rock-cut tombs of Persian kings. In the tradition of his forefathers, he had the inscription engraved in 3 languages: Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek. Narseh, who fought for his throne against Bahram II, left his own bilingual record on the Paikuli monument in Iraqi Kurdistan, recounting the conflict and his recognition by the leading nobles. Kirdir, who rose to extraordinary power in the later 3rd century, set up inscriptions in several royal sites describing his political rise, his service to Zoroastrianism, and even a spiritual vision of the afterlife. Other inscriptions from this period include the dedication of Bishapur's governor in honor of Shapur I, which announced the beginning of a distinct Sassanian era, and the more recently discovered text of Abnun that commemorates Shapur's victory over the Romans in 242 and establishes 239 as the first year of his reign. The secondary evidence comes largely from Greek and Latin writers of the Roman world, as well as Syrian and Manichaean testimonies written somewhat later. Dio Cassius and Herodian, though not always fully reliable, both described the rise of the Sassanians under Ardashir. Herodian in particular grasped the magnitude of the new Persian threat. Another important source is Heliodorus of Emesa, whose work provides a detailed description of the heavily armored Persian cavalry, a picture confirmed by reliefs, graffiti, and archaeological discoveries. Later authors continued this record. Ammianus Marcellinus, a native of Antioch, described the wars between Rome and Persia in the 4th century from his own perspective. Procopius of Caesarea, a close associate of the general Belisarius, wrote extensive histories of the Byzantine wars against Persians, Vandals, and Goths in the 6th century. His work was continued by Agathias of Myrina, who sought both to extend Procopius's history and to preserve its style while claiming access to the royal Sassanian archives. The early history of Christianity in the Sassanian Empire, as well as the policies of its rulers, can often be reconstructed from the so-called Acts of Martyrs. These texts, along with local chronicles and church histories, offer surprisingly detailed and sometimes reliable accounts, despite their late composition, the poor survival of manuscripts, and the tendency toward exaggeration and formulaic storytelling. Many authors of these works had once been Zoroastrians, who converted to Christianity after serving in official positions at the Sassanian court, which meant they were well acquainted with the institutions, social order, and traditions of the empire. As a result, a large body of sacred traditions, religious teachings, and community rules was preserved in writing. One striking example comes from Adiabene during the reign of Shapur II, when Christians were accused of rejecting sun worship, fire rituals, and royal military service, while promoting their own faith in a single god. Their practices were condemned as subversive, and they were charged with polluting water, refusing marriage, burying the dead in the earth, and even claiming that all creatures, including serpents and scorpions, were created by God rather than by evil forces. Such accusations reveal not only the tensions between communities, but also the deep cultural and religious divides within the empire. The Manichaean tradition provides another important perspective. Original Coptic writings from Egypt, along with significant discoveries in Central Asia of Middle Iranian, Old Turkish, and Chinese texts, allow scholars to examine Manichaean teachings from within rather than solely through the eyes of Christian or Zoroastrian opponents. Although many of these texts belong to later traditions, they still contain fragments of the writings of Mani himself. Among the most important finds is the Cologne Mani Codex, a small Greek manuscript that has reshaped our understanding of the environment in which Mani grew up and the development of his doctrines. These sources also shed light on how the Manichaean mission interacted with the Sassanian state, balancing its own identity against external pressures. Armenian historians likewise play a role in reconstructing the cultural and political landscape of the period. Their works are rich in detail about Sassanian Iran, reflecting the close ties between the two regions. Yet their writings, often composed centuries after the events they describe, reveal a strong anti-Iranian bias and must therefore be approached critically. Some were composed as early as the 5th century, while others were not written until much later, and their tendency to mix historical reporting with epic storytelling complicates their reliability. Other testimonies come from Middle Persian literature, often written long after the fall of the Sassanians. Many of these texts were only recorded in the Islamic period, and the oldest surviving manuscripts date no earlier than the 13th century. Their survival was shaped both by the oral character of Iranian culture and by efforts to preserve the memory of the good religion in the aftermath of conquest. While legendary cycles, ritual instructions, and epic courtly traditions dominate, they may still contain echoes of genuine historical detail. In the case of ritual texts and sacred prescriptions, oral preservation was especially rigorous, as highly trained Zoroastrian priests transmitted these traditions with notable accuracy. A culmination of these literary traditions was the composition of a national history of Iran during the late Sassanian period, brought together in the Quadai Namag, or Book of Lords. This sweeping narrative extended from the mythical first ruler, Gayamard, to the reign of Cosro II, recounting the lives of 50 rulers. Although it sought to unify earlier legends, traces of distinct cycles remain, and its narrative often shifts from heroic tales of warriors to accounts of sages and holy men posing ethical and philosophical questions. The result was not merely a chronicle, but a blend of moral instruction, royal speeches, philosophical reflection, and entertainment. By presenting ideals of justice, piety, and exemplary conduct through the lives of kings, heroes, and sages, the work aimed to reinforce the moral and political foundations on which the empire claimed to rest. In this sense, the Book of Lords functioned as much as a mirror of social values as it did a record of the past. Much more Middle Persian literature has survived than from the Parthian age, yet when religious and legal writings are set aside, only a handful of works remain, the most notable being the epic poem Ayadgar-i Zareren, Memorial of Zarer. Such pieces were typically performed with musical accompaniment, and the Sassanian court itself maintained a circle of poets and singers, with rulers like Bahram II said to have granted them special honor and prestige. This tradition of sung poetry outlived the empire and continued well into the Islamic era, particularly in rural regions. Still, the overall loss of Sassanian literary output was immense. Many works disappeared during the Muslim conquest and subsequent invasions, while others were suppressed by religious authorities or fell into neglect when Middle Persian script gave way to Arabic. Later translations, adaptations, and bibliographical notes in Arabic and New Persian provide only faint glimpses of what was once a wide-ranging body of literature that included not only sacred writings, but also works on history, geography, astronomy, ethics, etiquette, travel, historical romance, and popular storytelling. Perso-Arabic historical writing preserves part of this lost tradition, though it must be regarded as a tertiary source for the early Sassanian period. The reason is that Arabic universal historians relied heavily on the late Middle Persian compilations that had already been edited and reshaped before translation. Their importance lies in transmitting material that would otherwise have vanished, yet it came down through several stages. First compiled and revised in late Sassanian times, then translated and organized in the early Islamic era, and finally reframed to fit Islamic views of history. The degree to which these transformations altered or reshaped the original information is difficult to measure, and only close comparison between the Arabic accounts and surviving Sassanian material can clarify their reliability. What is required is careful distinction between the genuine content of these writings and the interpretations that modern scholarship places upon them. Complementing the written tradition are the famous rock reliefs of the Sassanian kings, closely related to inscriptions in both themes and locations. The most celebrated examples depict the investiture of Ardashir I and the victories of his son Shapur. Positioned either at sacred ancestral sites or at places of great military triumph, these reliefs combine divine symbolism with worldly events to project the authority and legitimacy of the monarch. They are invaluable not only for understanding royal ideology, but also for prosopography, since they portray kings alongside family members and high officials. More than 30 such reliefs survive, most of them concentrated in Persis, the Sassanian heartland, and largely commissioned by rulers of the 3rd and 4th centuries. The dominant theme is the divine bestowal of kingship, while others celebrate victories, depict combat, or present the ruler enthroned with his court. Though inspired by earlier Iranian relief traditions, these works represent the peak of early Iranian rock art. Debate continues about how to interpret them, whether they should be seen as unified expressions of royal ideology or as a mixture of idealized history and symbolic portrayals of kingship. Two of the most celebrated Sassanian reliefs are carved into the cliff at Naqsh-i-Rustam, beneath the great Achaemenid tombs. The first depicts the investiture of Ardashir I, where the king, mounted on horseback to the left, receives the ring of sovereignty from the god Ormazd, who also appears on horseback. Behind Ardashir stands his page, while beneath the hooves of the horses lie the defeated enemies of both king and god. The scene mirrors the divine struggle, with Ormazd overcoming the spirit of evil, Ahriman, while Ardashir claims victory over the final Parthian ruler, Artavan IV. Shapur I, Ardashir's successor, also appears on horseback in his own investiture scene, but he is best remembered for a series of triumphal reliefs. The most famous among them shows his victories over the Roman emperors Philip the Arab and Valerian. In this carving, Philip kneels in submission, while Valerian is held by Shapur, symbolizing the capture of the Roman emperor in 260. Philip is portrayed as pleading for mercy, while Valerian assumes the posture of a subject acknowledging his conqueror. Several related reliefs extend this narrative, depicting yet another Roman emperor, Gordian III, cast to the ground beneath the hooves of Shapur's horse. These images serve as timeless monuments of Persian victory, echoing Shapur's own account of his campaigns, where Gordian was killed near Mesish. Philip was forced to pay a vast ransom and accept tributary status, and Valerian himself was personally captured by the Sassanian king. After a long pause in the production of such monumental reliefs, which lasted from the 4th to the 7th century, the tradition was revived by Cosro II, At Taki Bustan in Media, near modern Kermanshah, the king presented himself in the Grand Ivan as a ruler chosen by divine favor and as a masterful horseman. Other scenes at the site show him engaged in dramatic hunts of wild boar and deer, blending royal imagery with symbols of prowess and fortune. Alongside these reliefs, two colossal statues have survived, one of Shapur I and another of Cosro II, offering rare examples of Sassanian sculpture in the round. Monumental architecture from this period is equally striking and survives in impressive remains across Iran. Ardashir founded the city of Ardakshir Kvara, laid out on a vast circular plan nearly 2 kilometers in diameter, divided into 4 sectors crossed by perpendicular axes and subdivided further by ringed streets. At its center stood a walled precinct containing a terraced sanctuary and a towering structure about 30 meters high, whose original purpose is still uncertain. Another important foundation was Bishapur, designed on a rectangular grid after the classical model and covering an area of more than 150 hectares. Here, palaces rose near the mountain fortress, and an underground structure has been interpreted as a place of worship. Shapur also created Junde Sabur, situated east of Susa, where he resettled craftsmen and specialists from Antioch. This city grew into a renowned cultural and scientific hub with its own academy, and soon became a major center for silk production, later remembered as an important Christian site in Khuzestan. Other cities were established under the Sassanians, though not all can be located today. The heart of the empire, however, remained at Ctesiphon on the Tigris, which continued to serve as the ceremonial capital and the place of coronations, often paired with the nearby city of Ardakshir. Among royal palaces, Ardashir's early residences between Shiraz and Firuzabad remain striking examples of Sassanian ambition. These include Kalahai Dukhtar, a fortified palace commanding a ravine, and Atashkada, a much larger structure at its base, designed with an Ivan, domed chambers, and vaulted suites across several stories. Shapur's palaces at Bishapur became famous for their Roman-inspired mosaics, while his, or possibly Khosrow Furun's palace at Ctesiphon left behind the monumental arch of the Tak-i-Kisra, still towering today despite later damage. Other Sassanian sites, such as Kasr-i Shirin near the modern border of Iraq and Iran, were destroyed in recent conflicts, but they testify to the widespread scale of royal building. Surviving examples of bridges, dams, and fortifications also attest to the practical achievements of the dynasty, many of them constructed with the labor of Roman prisoners. Religious architecture flourished as well, with numerous fire temples built in the form of 4 arched domed chambers, reflecting the Zoroastrian faith. The most significant sanctuary of the late Sassanian age was Takhti Sulayman in Azerbaijan, a vast complex of both sacred and secular buildings. Excavations have revealed its central role in the religious and political identity of the empire, making it one of the most remarkable monuments of pre-Islamic Iran. Among the most prized objects of Sassanian art are the silver bowls decorated with hunting scenes and other finely worked metal designs. Although much remains uncertain about who originally commissioned these pieces, what purpose they served, or what models they may have followed, it is clear that from the reign of Shapur, the second onward, they often displayed a central image of the king. He can usually be identified by his crown, and is portrayed either as a skilled hunter or as a ruler seated in majesty among his court. These objects seem to have had more political than practical meaning, most likely functioning as royal gifts exchanged within the empire and beyond. The fact that between the 4th and 6th centuries, the king seems to have held a monopoly over their production reinforces the idea that they carried a symbolic message, presenting the monarch as both the unshakable center of the state and the undefeatable warrior who safeguarded it. In this sense, such vessels may have taken over the role once played by rock reliefs, whose purpose had already been fulfilled with the secure establishment of the dynasty. Other products of Sassanian craftsmanship also deserve mention. Silk fabrics, which left a lasting impact on Western textile traditions, cameos cut with intricate detail, elegant glasswork, and the well-known stucco decorations all illustrate the richness of this artistic culture. Particular attention, however, must be given to Sassanian seals, bullae, and coins, as they offer historians invaluable evidence through their combination of images and inscriptions. Seals and clay bullae provide the names, titles, and roles of state and religious officials, offering insights into their political, administrative, and spiritual responsibilities. Coins are equally important. Their portraits, legends, and minting styles allow us to reconstruct the sequence of rulers with accuracy. Clay bullae from sites such as Qasr-i Abu Nasr in Fars and Takht-i Sulayman, which bear seal impressions from the late Sassanian period, remain more ambiguous. It is still debated whether they were used to secure goods or to authenticate documents. Stamp seals, often carved from semi-precious stones and worn on cords or rings, could display exceptional craftsmanship. They sometimes carried inscriptions, portraits of men or women, images of hunts or banquets, as well as depictions of animals or divine figures. Sassanian coins typically show the bust of the king on one side, distinguished by his unique crown and a surrounding inscription, while the reverse usually displays a fire altar with burning flames. Sometimes the altar is flanked by 2 attendants or contains a bust within the fire itself. Silver was the most common material, as gold and copper pieces were rarely issued. The standard denomination was the drachma, weighing about 4 grams, and under Shapur Sigsekun, this coin was produced in vast numbers, likely to fund the recruitment of Central Asian mercenaries. Mint names and the officials responsible for striking the coins are occasionally indicated, though the full range of mints remains difficult to reconstruct. From the reign of Kavad I onward, coins began to carry the year of issue as a standard feature. The so-called Kushano-Sassanian coins, struck by governors in the former Kushan territories, present a separate problem, and modern attempts to establish their chronology continue to produce widely differing results. The inscription on the rock relief of Shapur Thamur at Naqsh-i-Rajab near Persepolis presents him as the Mazda-worshipping Shapur, king of kings of Iran and non-Iran, descended from the gods, son of Ardashir and grandson of Pabag. In this short but powerful declaration, Shapur outlines how he wished to be seen, as divinely chosen, heir to his father and grandfather, and ruler not only of Iran, but also of conquered lands and their princes. The title, King of Kings, had existed before, yet the Sassanians gave it new force by combining it with the name of Aaron. Through this, they created the concept of Aaron-Shar, the empire of the Aryans, which allowed them to present themselves as the rightful successors of the Achaemenids, the mythical rulers of old, and the guardians of the Zoroastrian tradition rooted in Iran. By promoting Aaron-Shar as the cultural and political homeland, they forged a new identity for both themselves and their subjects, grounding it in the distant past. By calling himself a god, Shapur intended to place himself above mere earthly overlords, setting his kingship apart as divinely infused. Yet his divine status was not meant to be equated with great deities such as Ahura Mazda or Anahita. In Middle Persian texts, Shapur is given the title Bey, a designation that sets him apart from the Yazd, the true spiritual gods. For the Sassanians, there were therefore two levels of divinity: the king and his forebears, who were god-men in a tangible sense, and the transcendent deities, who were worshipped as spiritual beings. Shapur also underlined his close connection with the gods through his actions. He declared that with their help, he had conquered lands, and in return, he supported their cult by founding new fires, strengthening priestly establishments, and aiding the Magi. This presentation emphasized his role as both ruler and guardian of religion. Although such proclamations were clearly designed to legitimize his authority and did not necessarily reflect his personal beliefs or policies toward other religions, the link between fire and royal legitimacy is reinforced on Sassanian coins, which display fire altars. These have been interpreted as representing the king's personal fire, lit at the moment of his enthronement. Inscriptions confirm this practice, dating the fire of Ardashir to the early 220s and the fire of Shapur to around 239/240. This tradition of royal fires had already existed among the Achaemenids and Parthians, who also established flames in memory of deceased rulers. On the reverse of coins, attendants flank the fire altar, and from the reign of Hormizd II onward, a bust also appears within the flames. These figures have been interpreted in different ways: as the king and his spiritual companion, as the king with his divine fortune, or even as priests alongside the ruler. The bust within the flame has been linked to the concept of Svara, or divine glory, which legitimized kingship. A Sassanian romance about Ardashir dramatizes this belief. Ardavan, chasing the young Ardashir, is told that a ram running beside him symbolizes the arrival of Svara. Once this divine grace had reached him, Ardashir's destiny as king could not be thwarted, and rebellion against him was futile. Legitimacy was also reinforced through genealogy. Shapur linked himself to his father Ardashir and grandfather Pabag, while also seeking continuity with more distant ancestors, from clan leaders to the Achaemenid kings. Roman writers recorded Sassanian claims that the possessions of their forefathers should be restored to them, showing how ancestry was used to justify political demands. Within Iran, traditions linked the dynasty back to times before Alexander's conquests and to mythical rulers. A late Sassanian romance portrays Sassan, described as Ardashir's father and a shepherd of Pabag, as a descendant of Darius. Later writers, such as Tabari, elaborated genealogies connecting Ardashir to the legendary Kayanians, thus tying the Sassanians to both historical and mythical figures, while erasing the Arsacid line. In truth, however, the Sassanians inherited much from the Parthians. Although they claimed to centralize authority and distinguish themselves from the rule of petty kings, they retained many elements of Arsacid political culture: kingship tied to one family, a nobility structured by rank and lineage, aristocratic clans with enduring influence, and administrative practices rooted in Parthian traditions. This continuity is not surprising, since the Sassanians themselves had once been Parthian vassals, and only a short time separated the fall of the Arsacids from the rise of the new dynasty. After nearly 5 centuries of Parthian dominance in Iran, the imprint of Arsacid traditions on kingship, administration, social hierarchy, and historical memory was too deeply rooted for the Sassanians to erase completely. Stability at home could only be secured by preserving much of the existing order. both in institutions and in personnel. What the new dynasty brought was innovation in other directions. The revival of the leading role in resistance against Rome, the stronger emphasis on the distinctly Iranian identity of kingship and religion, and a closer association with the Zoroastrian deities. Both the wars with Rome and the promotion of Mazdaism were shaped by political calculation. Warfare served the purpose of strengthening and legitimizing the monarchy, while the close association with the gods offered divine sanction for the reign. The movement toward greater centralization emerged later, most clearly visible in the reforms of Khosrow I. Accounts from Middle Persian and Arabic writers that describe the inseparable bond of throne and altar under Ardashir must have been composed in later generations, rather than reflecting his own time. When it comes to succession, the Sassanians followed the Arsacid custom, in which the reigning monarch designated the heir. Yet disputes arose whenever the decision was unclear or when traditional rights were ignored, creating opportunities for the aristocracy and the clergy to intervene. King Narsa describes one such conflict in his inscription at Paikuli, preserving the letters exchanged and the speeches delivered at the time of his acclamation to demonstrate the legitimacy of his accession. Centuries later, Cosro II also sought to secure his claim with great care. In a letter to his rival Bahram II, he styled himself as the King of Kings, the Lord of Peoples, the Savior of men, one who rose with the sun and brought light to the night, famed through his ancestors, and the benefactor who restored Persian kingship. He declared that he had taken the throne in accordance with custom, that he would never set aside the diadem, and that he even expected to extend his rule to other worlds, if such a thing were possible. It has often been suggested that a royal council played some part in the succession, much like its Parthian counterpart, although the evidence is fragmentary. Inscriptions such as that of Paikuli, or later texts colored by Zoroastrian interpretation like the Letter of Tansar, point to some form of consultation with the highest dignitaries, though this may have been more symbolic than real. Even in the account of Ardashir's appointing Shapur as king, a formula is included inviting anyone who considered himself more righteous or better suited to govern the empire to make his claim. The enthronement and coronation of a new ruler were marked by carefully staged ceremonies. The king was seated on the throne at the place of his appointment, with princes of the royal family, grandees of the realm, and senior officials gathered in attendance. A vivid description of this process is found in the Letter of Tansar, written from the perspective of the clergy. According to this text, the crown and throne were placed in the audience hall at night, while nobles and priests assembled. The Mobad, accompanied by other religious figures, proclaimed before the assembled lords that God had revealed the rightful heir. The prince was then lifted onto the throne, the crown set upon his head, and his rule acknowledged as divinely sanctioned. A second and more solemn rite, the religious coronation, was normally performed in a fire temple, but unlike the Achaemenids, the Sassanians had no fixed sacred site for this occasion. The question of whether the Sassanians practiced co-regency has been debated in connection with the supposed joint rule of Ardashir I and Shapur I, but no clear conclusion has been reached. Ardashir himself, as the founder of the dynasty, became an increasingly idealized figure, especially in later centuries. His memory was celebrated in inscriptions that emphasized divine ancestry and heroic acts. Shapur V, in his own record, proudly declared his lineage from Ardashir and Pabag, and described a ceremonial arrow shot before the great lords of the realm, symbolizing the reach of his power. The aristocracy under the Sassanians was organized in distinct ranks. Shapur IV, in his Hajiabad inscription, listed 4 groups in order of importance. The first consisted of local dynasts and princes entrusted with governing key territories, referred to as Pardaran in Middle Persian and described in Greek as despotes ton ethnon. The second rank, the Vaspuragan, was made up of members of the royal clan not directly descended from the king. The third, the Vuzurgan, included the heads of the most prominent noble families, such as the Varas and the great Parthian houses of Surin and Karin, as well as other high-ranking lords. The fourth group, the Azadan, encompassed the wider body of Iranian nobility. Together, these groups formed the social and political backbone of the empire and played a decisive role in recognizing or contesting the authority of the throne. In Sassanian society, the duty to offer sacrifices for the souls of the living and the dead was a shared responsibility, and Shapur's record of deeds lists the names of contemporary figures from the 4 great groups of society, often mentioning their offices at court or within the empire. Inscriptions from Narseh make clear that the King of Kings and the aristocracy were bound together through mutual obligations, networks of support, and shared interests. These structures of prestige were not newly created by the Sassanians, but inherited from the Parthians. However, the Sassanians strengthened the role of the Persian nobility from the southwest, while still keeping the great Parthian houses in leading positions. Over time, new families also rose to prominence. The high aristocracy was expected to support the king and play a key part in the proclamation of a new ruler, lending both advice and legitimacy to the throne. Roman sources also shed light on the prestige of the Persian nobility. Ammianus recounts the story of a deserter named Antoninus, who was received with honor at the winter court of Shapur II. He was awarded the dignity of the tiara, which gave him the right to sit at the royal table and to speak in assemblies alongside the Persian elite. Such honors, as Ammianus notes, reflected closeness to the monarch, but also suggested that appearance and dress were outward signs of noble standing. Yet, before the later period of the dynasty, the most important measure of aristocratic status was not a royal title or mark of distinction, but lineage itself. Procopius still observed this during the reign of Kavad, noting that Persians believed offices should pass only to those who could claim the proper position of honor through ancestry. Distinctive markers of nobility included the colored and symbol-embroidered tiaras mentioned by Ammianus, along with jeweled belts and earrings. While the king could bestow such insignia, for a long time, noble rank existed independently of royal favor. Only in the later Sassanian centuries did these outward marks require the explicit approval of the monarch. As the historian Theophylactus explained, bestowed rank gradually became more highly valued than lineage itself. This shift was made possible after the mid-5th century crisis, when disastrous defeats of Peroz against the Hephthalites, combined with years of drought and famine, left the empire in a weakened state. The peasants bore the double burden of landlords and state taxes, while parts of the country fell under Hephthalite control. Many fled their lands, while others joined revolts inspired by the teachings of Mazdak, who preached communal ownership and social justice. The nobility, meanwhile, suffered heavy losses in war, internal divisions, and popular uprisings that undermined their strength. The reforms of Kavad Durm and his son Cosro I reshaped the empire's structure. They extended land taxation to aristocratic estates and reorganized both nobility and army, drastically redefining the balance between ruler and elite. Khosrau is remembered for crushing the Mazdakite movement, redistributing confiscated property, restoring lands to noble families, and tying aristocratic households directly to the crown. He arranged marriages for the children of prominent families, supplied dowries from the treasury, and ensured their loyalty by keeping them close at court, where they served in high offices. He also reorganized the cavalry, supporting men without property with horses and equipment, and established regular wages for soldiers. Judges, officials, and governors were chosen carefully and placed under strict royal authority. This strengthened the monarchy by creating both an administrative nobility and a military class that owed their positions to the king rather than to inherited prestige. At the local level, a new stratum of lower nobility known as the Decanan emerged. These wealthy landowners, sometimes controlling entire villages, were promoted by the crown with land, funds, and other resources to act as loyal supporters of royal power against both rebellious peasants and rival magnates. Yet, the balance between throne and aristocracy did not last. Khosrau I had divided the empire into 4 regions under the command of generals called spabeds, who were allowed to use a share of the land taxes to support their armies. Some of these commanders, along with other noble leaders, soon pursued their own ambitions, even seeking the throne. The most famous was Bahram II of the Miran family, who rebelled under Hormizd and made a brief bid for kingship around 590 to 591, later remembered in heroic tales, despite Cosro II's efforts to suppress his legacy. Although Cosro II temporarily centralized finances, tensions with the nobility deepened due to heavy taxation, military campaigns, and accusations of tyranny. After his fall, kingship became little more than a tool of aristocratic factions competing for power. The rapid conquests of the Muslim armies and the sudden disintegration of Sassanian authority highlight how internal rivalries and conflicting interests among the empire's leading classes fatally weakened the state in its final years before the rise of Islam. The sources from 3rd century Iran, such as inscriptions, reliefs, and coins, reveal that women of the royal family were granted remarkable attention and respect. Some were honored with sacred fires dedicated to their souls and lasting memory, and even received sacrifices in their name. They could hold distinctive titles. For example, Adur Anahid, daughter of Shapur Fern, was known as Queen of Queens and was mentioned before the king's sons, while Khoranzm, described as Queen of the Empire, is considered to have been Shapur's wife and was commemorated in sacrifices before Adur Anahid herself. Among other influential women of the early Sassanian period were Denag, the mother of Pabag, and grandmother of Ardashir, Rodag, the mother of Ardashir I, and another Denag, his sister, who also carried the title of Queen of Queens. This title has sometimes been taken as evidence of royal marriages within the family, such as between father and daughter or brother and sister, but there is no proof for such practices in these particular cases. Instead, the titles reflect their exceptional rank by birth. Royal women appear not only in inscriptions and reliefs, but also on coinage. For instance, Bahram II had himself portrayed alongside his queen and heir in the Roman fashion. They were also immortalized on engraved gems and seals of their own. It is therefore less surprising that shortly before the empire's collapse, women like Puran and her sister Azar-Migdukt were able to ascend the throne, even if this happened due to a lack of male successors. In the same period, The career of Kirdir provides insight into the rise of religious officials in Sassanian Iran. He recorded in his own inscription that he had long been entrusted with sealing legal agreements and documents concerning fire temples and the Magi, and that successive kings recognized him with honorific titles. Shapura called him Kirdir, the Mobad and Herbed. Hormizdrom and Bahram I named him the Mobad of Ormazd. And Bahram the Teku went so far as to style him Kirdir, whose soul Bahram saved, the Mobad of Ormazd. Later, he claimed that Bahram II raised him to the rank of Magnate and appointed him Mobad and judge of the whole empire, as well as overseer of the great fires of Anahid and Ardakshir in Stakhr. Kirdir's rise began with the modest role of Herbed, a low or middle-ranking cleric, and advanced step by step until he became the most powerful religious figure in the realm. Whether he legitimately attained the position of head of the Zoroastrian priesthood is uncertain, but if he did, all other priests, from minor temple guardians to caretakers of major provincial fires, would have fallen under his authority. What is certain is that he became the dominant religious dignitary of his time. From the 4th century onward, the structure of religious offices became more elaborate, reflecting the hierarchy of political power. Christian sources distinguish between a head of the Mobads, a great Mobad, and provincial Mobads. Later traditions attribute the formal establishment of the empire's highest religious, military, and administrative posts to Mihr Narse, the powerful vizier and general who served under Yazdgird I, Bahram V, and Yazdgird II. It is said that he arranged for his sons to hold offices that mirrored the 3 great functions of priest, warrior, and farmer, echoing ancient ideals while consolidating authority within his family. Much less is known about the middle layers of Sassanian society, but they must have included local officials, artisans, craftsmen, merchants, and entertainers, along with doctors, astronomers, scholars, and singers who worked in cities and at court. Beneath them stood the mass of peasants who formed the bulk of the population, and the bondmen. Zoroastrian texts often stress the tension between poor and rich, and the uprisings of the late 5th and early 6th centuries confirm that these conflicts could erupt violently during times of hardship. Accounts from later writers describe how burdensome taxation and aristocratic control weighed heavily on the rural population. One story tells of King Kavad witnessing a woman beating a girl for picking a pomegranate. When he questioned her, she explained that the crop could not be touched until the harvest was formally assessed for tax collection. Disturbed by this, Kavad reorganized the system in the province of Fars, dividing it into districts where harvests were recorded at set times, and where peasants and tenant farmers were given more freedom over their produce. This distinction between free peasants and tenant farmers suggests that some had managed to rise to independence and gain control over their own land. Other sources, such as the deeds attributed to Cosro I Anoshervan, also emphasize concern for the rural population. Unlike previous rulers, Cosro is said to have restructured taxation, kept accurate records, and prevented abuses by requiring judges to listen to complaints directly from taxpayers without interference from landlords or tax collectors. These reports describe how grievances were written down, sealed, and presented before high officials and nobles, forcing oversight of potential injustices. Yet the later accounts of encroachments by the wealthy under Khosrow's successors and the king's eventual downfall show that such measures did not bring lasting relief. Zoroastrian and Arab writers describe the Sassanian Empire as a society where social mobility was restricted by rigid rules, requiring official approval before someone could advance in rank, and even prescribing certain clothing according to class. In practice, however, these ideals of strict class loyalty were not always fully enforced. When it comes to slavery, aside from the many prisoners of war captured during Shapur's campaigns, most of our information comes from a Middle Persian legal text known as the Book of 1,000 Judgments, Madayan-i Hazar-Dadistan, a compilation of cases produced under Cosro II. Additional evidence is found in later Middle Persian writings, as well as in a Syriac collection of laws compiled by Ishobukht. The terminology used in these texts is revealing. The word bandage could refer both to a free subject and to a dependent bondman, while tan or body was applied to debtors or individuals with restricted legal capacity. The most common expression for a slave was anparig, meaning foreigner, which reflects the fact that war captivity was the primary source of slaves. Other routes into servitude included children being sold by their fathers and the inheritance of slave status from parents. Legal views shifted over time. Initially, a child's condition followed that of the father, but later it was determined by the mother. Slaves were regarded as property, or svastag, yet they were also recognized as human beings, which offered some protection against extreme cruelty. They could be sold, rented out, transferred as security, or even shared by several owners. Anything they produced belonged to their master. Some slaves resembled serfs tied to the land, similar to the Roman concept of peasants bound to estates, who were sold together with the farmland they cultivated. Slaves who practiced the Zoroastrian religion were not permitted to be sold to non-believers, and if they happened to belong to a non-Zoroastrian, they could purchase their freedom by compensating him for his loss. Remarkably, slaves could appear in court as witnesses, plaintiffs, or defendants. Owners could grant them special property of their own, and manumission was possible, either fully or partially in cases where several individuals shared ownership. Freedom was confirmed through a document called Azad Hipt, after which the former slave became a free subject of the King of Kings. The empire also had temple slaves, such as the Anparig-i Ataxp, who worked on estates owned by fire temples. These differed from men known as Ataxp Bandag or Aduran Bandag, who were free individuals serving shrines at the king's command. The most famous example of this dual role was Mir Narse, a powerful vizier in the 5th century. He served at shrines under Bahram II, was demoted to labor as a temple slave on crown land under Yazdgerd II, and was later reinstated to sacred service under Peroz. Although the exact number of slaves in the empire is unknown, it must have been very large. The legal works of the Sassanian period are also our main sources for understanding the household and family. Unlike Rome, the Sassanians never produced a unified civil code, nor did they establish a body of secular law entirely separate from Zoroastrian religious ethics. The Book of 1,000 Judgments functioned as a detailed guide for jurists, offering precise legal terms, case studies, and the opinions of specialists. It was compiled between Khosrow's accession in the late 6th century and the Arab conquest in the early 7th century by Farakmard, a jurist from the city of Ghor in Fars. His work drew upon commentaries on the legal sections of the Avesta, earlier collections of rulings, expert memoranda, instructions for court officials, royal decrees, and both state and private archives. Other Middle Persian texts dealing with law also survive, though they are less significant. Among Christian communities, Zoroastrian law strongly influenced works such as the Corpus Juris by the Metropolitan Mar Ishobukht. Written originally in Middle Persian in the 8th century for Christians in Persis, it survives in a Syriac translation made around the year 800. Later, Christian texts include writings by Mar Simeon, another metropolitan of Persis, and a Syriac legal treatise on marriage law produced under the leadership of the Catholicus Mar Abba during Cosro I's reign. The Sassanian family is perhaps best described as a household, comparable to the domestic units of ancient Greece and Rome, rather than as a family in the modern sense. This does not mean that we know how many generations typically lived together, since most of the evidence reflects legal rules rather than descriptions of daily life. Middle Persian used the words dudag, smoke, and kadag, house, to denote nuclear and extended family structures. The head of the household was the kadagsvadai, the master of the house, while his wife was the kadag banug. Together with their sons, daughters, and dependents, they formed a unit that was at once legal, economic, and religious. Some household members acted in their own right, such as the master and his adult male descendants, while others, such as women and minors, were included through their dependence on others. The household itself belonged to larger kinship groups, similar to the Greek genos or the Roman gens, identified in Middle Persian by the terms Naf, Tom, and Gor. These clans preserved the memory of their founding ancestors, organized common rituals, and held commemorative feasts. Each household carried out religious duties for the souls of paternal forebears, just as the clan maintained ancestral cults. Although families could make use of shared resources like pastures, mills, and irrigation systems, they were limited in transferring property outside their group. Kin also played a role in inheritance, guardianship, and adoption, depending on the degree of relationship. In Sassanian society, male members of a family were considered adults at the age of 15, when they were formally welcomed into the community through a ceremony in which they received a belt and garment as symbols of their new legal status. Authority within the wider kin group rested in a council of senior men who played a central role in supervising weddings and adjudicating legal matters. New members could be brought into this circle through adoption, carried out with the consent of the kin group. For a long time, marriages were arranged within the family line, with unions between close relatives seen as normal practice. However, we should be cautious about assuming that this extended to unions between full siblings or parents and children, even in the royal family. Still, marriages between relatives were so common across Iran and neighboring regions that both Christian leaders and Roman officials later felt compelled to forbid the practice among their subjects. Social rank and eligibility for office in this world were strongly tied to descent. It is not surprising that the word used to describe a freeborn man came to mean nobleman as well. The most common marriage form was known as the Pax Paii union, comparable to the Roman manus marriage. In this arrangement, the bride moved into her husband's household, severing all legal ties with her original family. She took on the role of mother of the children, leader of the household, and participant in family rituals, while also becoming legally subject to her husband's authority. The children of such a marriage inherited not only their father's property and rank, but also his religious and economic obligations. In the Sassanian period, marriage contracts became more formalized, recording the obligations of both bride's guardian and groom. Men could marry at 15, while women could be married before adulthood, provided it was not against their will. Polygamy was permitted. and within the royal family both polygamy and marriage between relatives are well attested. A wife generally remained under her husband's authority for life, and was not entitled to hold property unless this was explicitly stated in the marriage contract. Her dowry, however, stayed hers, with the husband serving only as trustee. If a marriage was childless, the dowry was returned to her family upon her death. Divorce was possible for either party, though it required the consent of the other, except in cases of childlessness or proven misconduct by the wife. Like marriage, divorce had to be made public and recorded, with documents specifying the return of dowry or nuptial gifts. In matters of inheritance, a widow could be treated like a son, inheriting a full share of her husband's estate, and her new guardian was usually her eldest adult son, or, if none existed, the nearest male relative of her husband. If the marriage had been childless, she was required to marry her husband's closest male relative in a form of levirate marriage, while still retaining her status as the legal wife of the deceased. Children from this new union were regarded as heirs of the deceased husband, not of their biological father. Christian jurists criticized such marriages, as they did the custom of marrying relatives. The law also recognized the case of an inheriting daughter, a girl with no brothers who would be married to a paternal relative to preserve her father's household, even if this meant dissolving an existing marriage. Her children from this arrangement were counted as heirs of her maternal grandfather. Besides the Padixpaya union, other types of marriage existed, such as unions formed by a woman's free choice without transferring her legal ties to another family, or arrangements in which a husband, under certain conditions, entrusted his wife and her property to another man for a time. In such cases, she remained the lawful wife of her first husband, who acted as her guardian, and the children were considered his. Sassanian law also laid down detailed rules regarding guardianship of minors, women, and families without male members. Guardianship could arise naturally within the family, be assigned by the kin group in the absence of male relatives, or be arranged by the father of a household, who might appoint an outsider if necessary. Because preserving the household and ensuring the continuation of religious obligations were considered paramount, inheritance and succession rules were carefully defined. A distinction was made between heirs who were legitimate continuators of the house and substitute heirs when no direct male heir existed. These substitute heirs, whether widows, daughters, or relatives appointed by will or custom, were charged with providing a son for the deceased household head, ensuring that his line and obligations continued. Although much more could be said about Sassanian law regarding property, obligations, and inheritance, these principles already demonstrate the central role played by family structure, descent, and ritual duty in shaping the legal order of the time. In his inscription, Shapur records the names of the nobles, officials, and aristocrats who were closest to him and who were therefore entitled to have offerings made for the welfare of their souls. Comparable lists survive in other records as well, including another section of the same inscription where he refers to the reigns of Pabag and Ardashir, and in the Paikuli inscription of Narse. These lists follow a similar pattern. They begin with members of the royal family, continue with the leading noble houses, and end with other officials and dignitaries. Examining these records allows us to outline the early Sassanian state in its administrative character, and to reconstruct the hierarchy of authority at court and in government. One of the key issues in understanding the imperial system is the division of the empire into territorial units. The earliest evidence comes from the inscriptions of Shapur, Narseh, and the high priest Kirdir. In Shapur's own account, he enumerates the provinces under his authority, ranging from Persis and Parthia to Khuzestan, Mycenae, Mesopotamia, Adiabene, Arabia, Atropatene, Armenia, Iberia, Albania, Balasagan up to the Caucasus, the Elburz region, Media, Hyrcania, Margiana, Aria, the eastern provinces, Kirman, Sakistan, Turkestan, Makran, Paradine, Sind, and the Kushan lands as far as Peshawar and beyond to the borders of Central Asia, as well as the coastal region of Oman. Comparing this list with that of Narseh and with Kirdir's partial classification reveals both continuity and change. Shapur entrusted several frontier regions as kingdoms to his sons and other princes, a practice inherited from the Parthian system of local rulers. His sons held important borderlands. Hormizd Ardashir governed Armenia as crown prince. Another son ruled Messene. Narseh controlled the territories of the Saka and coastal lands, and Bahram ruled in Gilan. Other royal relatives were placed over Adiabene, Kirman, and Iberia. Later inscriptions also mention rulers in Kushan, Khwarezm, Makran, Gurgan, Balasagan, Albania, and elsewhere, though not all were clearly subjects of the Sassanian king. Modern scholarship often calls these rulers vassals, though whether the European idea of vassalage, oaths, military service, and land grants applied here cannot be confirmed. A second type of administrative unit was the province, governed by a satrap. 7 such governors are named in Shapur's inscription, but the actual number must have been much larger, covering territories directly under royal control, such as former Parthian crown lands or newly conquered areas. Cities founded by the king were also located on this royal land. The precise scale of these provinces, compared with earlier satrapies, remains uncertain. For the later Sassanian period, especially the 6th and 7th centuries, the picture is clearer thanks to seals and bullae that preserve names, titles, and offices. Most finds come from western Iran, while the east remains less documented. Additional details are provided by Christian sources such as Syriac martyr acts and church synods. Law books of the period attribute the introduction of official seals to Kavod and Cosro I, and recent studies of the seal impressions have shed light on the structure of provincial administration. The province was the core unit, subdivided into districts. Most offices attested in the sources operated at the provincial level, while only a few, such as the Amargar and Framadar, could hold responsibilities that extended beyond a single province. Religious officials, such as the Meg, generally worked at the district level. The governor of a province dealt with civil administration, cooperating with the Amargar, who managed taxes, and with the Ostendar, who oversaw royal estates. The governor does not seem to have shared authority with the clergy. Each province also had a chief priest, the Mogbed, who supervised religious matters and clerical estates. Above him stood a hierarchy that culminated in the chief priest of the empire. Another official, the protector of the poor and judge, represented the weak in legal cases and may have inherited duties once associated with the priest judges of earlier times. Civil judges also operated alongside these religious legal authorities. Other positions included advisors, some of whom served at court while others worked in the provinces, often connected with educational or ceremonial roles. Eunuchs, for instance, sometimes served as advisors to the royal women. There were also officials associated with protocol, finances, or archives, though their duties remain less clearly defined. The Framadar held an especially high post, sometimes overseeing multiple provinces or great religious institutions, and in some cases bore the title Great Framadar. Another important office was that of the Amargar, responsible for fiscal matters, including taxation, both at the provincial and regional levels. The office of the Magi, which operated only on the district level, is known to us mainly through seal impressions. It seems to have dealt with the settlement of local disputes and may have acted as a mediator before matters were passed on to higher authorities, such as the provincial chief priest or the judge. Together with the Mobad and the Rad, whose precise duties are less clear, these officials also played an important role in interrogating and condemning Christians during times of persecution. In the Christian martyr narratives, they often appear alongside guards, jailers, and executioners. Some provincial offices had equivalents on the imperial level, such as the High Mobad or the chief judge of the empire. But for other positions like the tax overseer or the Framadar, such connections are harder to establish. At the very top of the administrative structure were figures who moved in the immediate circle of the King of Kings. Among these were the Bide Axp, often thought of as a viceroy or grand vizier, and probably always a royal family member, and the Argbed, whose title has been interpreted either as a fortress commander or as chief tax collector. His prominence is evident from his position ahead of even the princes in some inscriptions, as well as from the occasions where he represented the king directly. Another key figure was the Zendenig, likely head of the state prison in Khuzestan, remembered in tradition as the Castle of Oblivion. The court also included a number of important posts, some with Parthian origins. Chief among them was the Hazaruft, the commander of the king's bodyguards, who, as in Achaemenid times, should not be confused with a prime minister. He was likely accompanied by the commander of the palace guards, the master of the gates, and other senior officers. Highly respected, too, were roles such as the caller to meals, the royal arms bearer, the overseer of servants, the master of supplies, and the royal treasurer. Ardashir's court added positions such as the marshal, the cupbearer, and the master of the hunt, later expanded under Shapur to include a master of wild boars. The head of the scribes was another significant figure, and evidence suggests that this post often remained within certain families due to the specialized skills it demanded. Eunuchs held both domestic and political roles at court, while singers preserved and performed the traditional lore of Iran. The courts of lesser kings and provincial rulers may well have mirrored the royal court, making the early Sassanian state essentially one bound together by networks of personal relationships rather than by an impersonal bureaucracy. The king's personal domains, known as Dastgird, stood apart from the lands of the nobility. In aristocratic territories, royal authority was weaker, and taxation and troop levies could only be carried out through the cooperation of local magnates. By contrast, only on royal land could new cities be founded, resettled, or renamed, which is why early Sassanian rulers tried to expand these holdings. Ardashir's victories allowed him to do so, but his successors, lacking major territorial gains, struggled to continue his program of urbanization until Kavad and Khosrow seized the opportunity after weakening the nobility during the Mazdakite uprisings. The autonomy of old Hellenistic cities in Mesopotamia and Susiana under the Sassanians is uncertain, though Susa clearly lost its status after Shapur II's harsh measures against it in his campaign against Christians. City foundations often went hand in hand with forced resettlements. Shapur IV and Cosro I are known to have deported groups from Antioch and relocated them within the empire, thus supplying labor and skilled artisans. Prisoners of war and deportees were a key element in strengthening the urban population, while voluntary migration or the transfer of villagers into towns played a minor role. Reforms under Kavad and Cosro also reshaped the empire's tax system. Previously, levies varied depending on cultivation and were assessed directly on crops, leading to unstable revenues. Kavad initiated surveys of farmland, which Cosro completed, counting both fields and trees to create a fixed tax base. From then on, specific rates were applied. 1 dirham per unit of wheat or barley, higher amounts on vineyards and alfalfa, and levies on date palms and olive trees, while other produce was exempt to encourage nourishment. A poll tax was imposed on all but nobles, soldiers, priests, scribes, and officials, graded by wealth and with exemptions for the very young and the elderly. This system ensured predictable income for emergencies and military campaigns, while removing earlier inconsistencies between royal land and aristocratic estates. Although some have argued that these reforms were modeled on Roman Byzantine systems, their impact within Iran was profound. By Cosro II's reign, however, taxes had increased so drastically that popular discontent became widespread. Later writers recalled Cosro II's maxim that the strength of the kingdom depended on the army on money, money on taxation, taxation on agriculture, agriculture on justice, justice on honest officials, and the officials on the integrity of the viziers, with the king himself at the top as the guardian of fairness. In practice, this principle was rarely upheld, and by the end of the dynasty, excessive taxation contributed to the weakening of the empire. As in most ancient societies, agriculture formed the backbone of the Sassanian economy. The majority of the population lived in rural areas, working the land either as free peasants or dependent farmers. For the elite, land ownership was both the primary source of wealth and the foundation of social prestige, with large estates and numerous retainers serving as key markers of influence. Even the royal treasury relied more heavily on agricultural taxation than on urban revenues, and the army itself was largely recruited from the countryside. The taxation system, as described by Tabari, highlights the central crops of the empire: cereals such as wheat, barley, and rice, alongside vineyards, alfalfa, date palms, and olive groves. Products like vegetables, cotton, sesame, and cucumbers were excluded from taxation, likely because they were cultivated for local household use. Single, isolated date palms were also exempt, as they were considered free for public consumption. Pastures are not directly mentioned by Tabari, though Mas'udi records that in Iraq, grazing land was subject to a high tax, possibly to discourage farmland from being converted into pasture. The province of Khuzestan is the best-studied example of Sassanian agricultural organization. Research shows that while cereals, rice, dates, and sugarcane were the major crops, the period also witnessed a notable migration of people into cities, accompanied by a decline in agricultural output. This trend is puzzling given the significant investment in dams, canals, and irrigation projects that both archaeology and textual sources attest to. Beyond farming, trade and craftsmanship occupied an important role. One illustrative account comes from the story of Pusai, a Christian artisan and martyr under Shapur II. Descended from deportees resettled in Persia, he became renowned as a master weaver and gold embroiderer. Shapur gathered skilled workers from across the empire, forming royal workshops overseen by a chief craftsman, and eventually appointed Pusai to that role. This position, also known as Kiragbed, placed him above the heads of guilds and trade associations, highlighting the prestige attached to royal manufacturing. Pusai's career reflects both the restrictions placed on deported artisans, such as limited freedom of movement, and the privileges they could gain, including the right to intermarry with locals. Skilled labor, often drawn from prisoners of war, contributed to industries such as textiles in Khuzestan, construction, metalworking, and dyeing. Roman captives in particular left a lasting mark through their work on bridges, dams, and other monumental structures. Deportees often retained their cultural and religious identity, but the relative freedom of worship granted by the Sassanians, combined with economic security and social recognition, helped mitigate the hardships of displacement. Resistance among these groups is scarcely documented. Urban society also included free artisans organized into guilds, such as goldsmiths, silversmiths, and merchants, who signed synodal decrees alongside church leaders. Sassanian merchants, however, were especially noted for their role as intermediaries rather than producers, profiting from the movement of luxury goods, silk, spices, jewels, perfumes, hides, exotic animals, and slaves between East and West. Yet their position in international trade was not always secure. Following the peace treaty of 297/8, Persians were restricted to trading only at Nisibis, which caused financial losses and limited their access to Roman markets. Later treaties redefined these terms, adding or removing trade centers such as Callinicum, Artaxata, and Dara, while also tightening controls on Arab and other foreign merchants. Despite these obstacles, Persia retained significant advantages as the middleman in East-West exchange, leading the Byzantines to experiment with sericulture, expand ties with Axum and Arabia, and eventually seek alliances with the Turks to bypass Persian dominance. Maritime trade also played a vital role. Persian merchants maintained routes to India through the Persian Gulf, a continuation of patterns established in Parthian times. The prophet Mani himself is said to have sailed from Mesopotamia to India, stopping at ports in Fars and reaching as far as Deb, identified with Daibul near Karachi. By the 4th century, records of increasing contact with India appear, particularly through the missions of Eastern Syriac Christians, who traveled both by land and sea to the Malabar coast and even Sri Lanka. The metropolitan seat of Rev Ardashir claimed a special connection to these Indian communities, asserting authority over them despite lacking clear jurisdiction. Commercial activity in the Persian Gulf required the control of the northeastern Arabian coast, and it was for this reason that Ardashir IV sought to dominate the regions of Avaz and Mashan, establishing cities there and even, according to early accounts, advancing as far as Bahrain. Later, after Arab incursions into Fars at the beginning of Shapur II's reign, the king retaliated with a harsh campaign deep into Arabia, constructing defensive lines in southern Iraq and deporting Arab groups to Kerman and Avaz. Oman, which was more closely tied to southwestern Iran than to Arabia, had already been under Sassanian control since the time of Shapur I. In Mesopotamia, the dynasty relied on the Lakhmids of Hira, who served as guardians against Byzantium, their Ghassanid allies, and the Bedouin of the Najd. Under Al-Mundir III, who ruled between 503 and 554, the Sassanians extended their authority over much of eastern Arabia, including Bahrain, Oman, Yamama, Najd, and the Hejaz, as far as Taif. Their influence even reached Yathrib, later Medina. When Cosro II suppressed the attempt of the Lakhmid ruler Numan III to break free, the weakening of this Arab buffer zone left the region exposed, paving the way for the successes of Muhammad's armies decades later. Sassanian interest in Arabia extended southward as well. Cosro I dispatched an army under the general Varis to Yemen, where it advanced as far as Sana'a. The Persians expelled the Ethiopian forces, who were allied with Byzantium, and installed a local prince as their vassal. Persian influence in the region endured until the closing years of Muhammad's life. Control of South Arabia, especially around the Gulf of Aden, was crucial for restricting Byzantine access to trade through the Red Sea. To the inhabitants of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Sassanians were both significant trade partners and dangerous military rivals. Persian armies frequently clashed with Roman forces or broke through the frontier to plunder towns and countryside. Eyewitnesses described their soldiers as a formidable sight. Entire companies of cavalry were covered head to toe in iron plates fitted with precision, leaving only tiny gaps at the eyes and nostrils. Armed with lances, many stood rigidly as though locked in bronze, while behind them archers prepared their bows, a weapon in which the Persians had excelled since early times. Even more terrifying were the war elephants, whose sheer presence struck fear into their enemies. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus recorded such descriptions during the Emperor Julian's campaign in 363. He noted that the backbone of the Sassanian army, as with the Parthians, was its heavily armored cavalry. Tabari later explained that under Cosro I, a cavalryman was required to possess full horse armor, chainmail, a breastplate, greaves, sword, lance, shield, club, axe, quiver, 2 bows, 30 arrows, and spare strings. Procopius claimed that the elite unit of this cavalry was known as the Immortals, reviving the name once used by the Achaemenids. Light cavalry was often drawn from allied peoples such as the Sakastanians, Galans, Albanians, Kushans, Hephthalites, Turks, and Arabs. Infantry was made up largely of bowmen, protected by wicker shields and rawhide, alongside simple foot soldiers. These men, usually peasants, were poorly armed and often unpaid, serving as attendants for the armored horsemen, guarding supply trains, or assisting in sieges and earthworks. Their main weapons were spear and shield. Over time, the Persians became as skilled as the Romans in siegecraft, sometimes even surpassing them. The army was commanded by the spabed, known from inscriptions as early as the 3rd century, supported by the aspbed who commanded the cavalry. In the early 5th century, Mir Narse established a higher office known as the Supreme Commander, which later evolved into the division of military leadership into 4 spabeds under Cosro I, each responsible for 1/4 of the empire. Other important officers included the Pegospanen, who commanded provincial forces, and the Marsbanen, who oversaw border districts. Khosrau also reformed recruitment by creating the corps of al-Asawira, equipping poor men with horses, weapons, and pay. Detailed records were kept of every soldier's arms, mounts, and service, while frontier troops were granted fiefs to secure their loyalty. Battles were typically decided by massed cavalry charges, supported by the constant rain of arrows from archers. The commander-in-chief remained in the center near the imperial standard, protected by elite guards. This formation was strong, but also vulnerable. If the general fell or fled, the army often collapsed. Despite their past successes against Rome and Byzantium, the armored cavalry eventually found themselves overmatched by the swift and lightly armed horsemen of the Muslim armies. Accounts also show that the Sassanians valued single combat as part of warfare. In 421, during a conflict with Byzantium, Bahram V challenged the Romans to send forth a champion, promising a 50-year peace treaty if the Persian warrior prevailed. The duel, however, ended in the Persians' defeat, leading to the treaty nonetheless. Such encounters were deeply rooted in Iranian tradition and celebrated in reliefs and artworks. For the Sassanians, military skill and personal bravery were essential to royal legitimacy. Kings themselves led campaigns, gaining prestige through courage and divine favor. They depicted themselves as warriors on reliefs, silver vessels, and in illustrated manuscripts, where each monarch was shown with distinctive clothing and crown. Like the rulers of earlier empires, they sought to immortalize their victories in writing, leaving military treatises that affirmed both their authority and their role as champions of Iran. When Bahram I, King of Kings and son of Shapur, passed away, the throne was taken by Bahram II, son of Bahram, who was remembered as generous, just, benevolent, and deeply devoted to the faith. Out of reverence for Ormuzd and the other gods, and also for the sake of his own soul, he elevated the authority and titles of leading figures within the empire. Under his rule, religious devotion to Ormuzd and the traditional deities was strengthened throughout the provinces, and Zoroastrianism, together with the Magi, gained new prominence. Sacred elements such as water, fire, and domestic animals were revered and honored, while the influence of Ahriman and the cults of idols suffered heavy setbacks. Doctrines associated with false deities declined, their credibility undermined, and communities such as Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Nazarenes, Christians, Baptists, and Manichaeans endured repression. Their temples were destroyed, their idols smashed, and many shrines were converted into sanctuaries of the gods. The inscriptions of the high priest Kirdir provide particularly striking testimony to this period, for he claimed that during the reign of Bahram II he advanced the Zoroastrian faith, while other religions were actively suppressed. These inscriptions are important because they not only list the various religious groups then present in the empire, but also reveal a deliberate policy aimed at defining the place of minorities in a specifically Zoroastrian political and spiritual order. When examining the nature of Zoroastrianism in the Sassanian age, historians encounter several challenges. Religious texts are not uniform in content or chronology, interpretations among scholars differ greatly, and older stereotypes have often clouded the discussion. Yet there are undeniable facts. Sassanian Iran witnessed a more extensive Zoroastrianization than at any earlier point in its history. Religion shaped legal traditions, literature, symbolic art, and burial customs, particularly the exposure of the dead and the later burial of bones. Priests and religious authorities were present at every level of society, from small villages to the royal court, to ensure rituals were carried out and traditions upheld. At the same time, a clearer hierarchy of offices, responsibilities, and sacred sites emerged. It was during this period that the Avesta was first written down, following the example of other sacred scriptures such as the Torah and the Bible, a step that gave the Zoroastrians a recognized status as people of the book. This effort, along with extensive commentary and interpretation, proved crucial for the community's later history. The Sassanian monarchs consistently presented themselves as champions of the faith. They established fire temples and sanctuaries, presenting their close relationship with the divine as a source of legitimacy and divine right to rule. Endowments for the benefit of both the living and the dead reflected the belief that the fate of the soul could be aided by acts of service to the community and support for descendants. Still, many questions remain unresolved. scholars continue to debate whether the kings adhered strictly to orthodox Zoroastrianism or followed the Zurvanite interpretation, whether the earliest Sassanians banned the use of images in worship in favor of fire cults, and whether the Avesta was truly canonized under Ardashir I, as later tradition claimed. Another long-debated question is whether, by the time of the Islamic conquest, Zoroastrianism had become overly rigid and burdened by ritualism, making it less appealing to its followers, or whether it was simply external political and military pressures that reduced it to a minority faith. By contrast, the history of Christianity within the Sassanian Empire is somewhat clearer. Christian communities had already taken root in Mesopotamia and Iran during the 2nd century under the Arsacid rulers, and Edessa became a central hub of Christian missionary activity. Yet the decisive growth of Christianity within the empire came not through missionary zeal, but through the mass deportations carried out by Shapur IV. After his victories in Roman Syria, Cilicia, and Cappadocia, Shapur resettled hundreds of thousands of Christians in Mesopotamia, Persis, and Parthia. Both royal inscriptions and later chronicles confirm that these deportees were concentrated in fertile but underpopulated regions like Khuzestan and Meshan, where they were employed in major construction projects. Many were skilled craftsmen and artisans, which strengthened the economy and accelerated the integration of Christian communities. Although Shapur's motives were mainly economic and demographic rather than religious, his policy unintentionally encouraged the spread of Christianity in Iran. Economic support for the new settlers, the solidarity among believers, and their sense of social advancement, combined with the relief of having escaped Roman persecution, contributed to the growth of the faith. According to sources, this period of peace and prosperity for Christians lasted until the reign of Bahram II, when the first persecutions occurred. Even then, however, such persecutions remained relatively rare until later in the 4th century, with the martyrdom of figures such as Bahram's concubine Candida standing out as exceptions. By the early years of the new century, many Christians fleeing Roman oppression under Galerius even sought refuge in the Sassanian Empire. At the same time, internal disputes within the Christian community in Persia began to appear. These disputes often centered on church organization, especially the claim of the bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon to primacy over other bishops in the empire. Although personal rivalries and ambitions seem to have been as important as doctrinal issues, these disagreements shaped the community's development. By the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325, only one Persian bishop, likely Yohanan bar Mariam of Arbela, took part, reflecting both the diversity and the challenges facing the Sassanian Church at that time. For the Christians living under the Persian Empire, a completely new political landscape began to take shape. On one side, they had a ruler in Shapur II, whose central aim was to overturn the unfavorable peace terms of Nisibis and who was preparing with determination for renewed war against Rome. On the other, the Roman Emperor Constantine had taken it upon himself to regard all Christians as his subjects and protect them, even without their request. This situation created suspicion in Persia that the Christian population might act as agents of Rome. After the first Persian setbacks in the conflict, Shapur demanded that Shemon bar Sabae, the newly appointed metropolitan of Seleucia Ctesiphon, impose a special tax on Christians to fund the war effort. When the bishop refused, this defiance became the beginning of the first systematic persecution of Christians in the Sassanian realm. In accounts of the time, Shapur accused Simeon of harboring political motives, claiming that his loyalty was to the emperor in Rome, who shared his faith rather than to the Persian throne. This mistrust was not entirely groundless. Writings from the Christian intellectual Afrahat suggest sympathy with Rome and speak of Constantius as the bringer of good, while portraying Shapur as the embodiment of arrogance and evil. The Chronicle of Arbela also records accusations made by Jews and Manichaeans that Christians were essentially spies, keeping Rome informed about events within Persia. Yet very little is known about how Christians themselves viewed their identity during this period. What can be assumed is that their primary concern was the freedom to practice their religion, to organize their churches, and to maintain spaces where they could live according to their faith. In martyrological texts, they referred to themselves with terms such as people of God, believers in the Messiah, or simply as the faithful, while opponents often used labels like Nasraye or Christiane, distinguishing between local Christians and those descended from earlier deportees. Language did not isolate them as a minority, for Syriac was widely spoken throughout the region, and Greek was likely still used by communities of earlier deported Christians. Middle Persian, while the tongue of the royal court and Zoroastrian clergy, was never imposed as an official lingua franca in the multilingual empire. Thus, Christians could still see themselves as ordinary inhabitants of Persian lands, while at the same time holding firmly to their religious identity. The conflict arose when Shapur's policies forced them to choose between loyalty to their faith and obedience to the throne. One account captures this dilemma in a dialogue between Shapur and Bishop Simeon. When the king asked about his loyalty, Simeon affirmed his prayers for the king's well-being, but declared that his devotion to God outweighed any earthly friendship. Persecutions flared intermittently, sometimes easing during truces such as the peace concluded with Emperor Jovian in 363 and recurring until the mid-5th century. A turning point came at the synod held in Seleucia Ctesiphon in 410, when the Persian Christians established their own hierarchical organization, independent of outside control. By 424, another synod formally rejected any authority beyond their own Catholicos, making the Church of the East fully autonomous. Initially, they upheld the Nicene Creed, but by 484, at the Synod of Beth Lapat, they formally embraced the Nestorian doctrine of the dual nature of Christ. This decision not only reflected theological alignment with teachings already popular in Persian border regions, but also served to eliminate any suspicion of collaboration with the Roman Empire. This independence did not represent a withdrawal into heresy, so much as a distancing from the Roman imperial church, which had increasingly fused its identity with the empire itself. The Sassanian kings welcomed this development. They entrusted Christian bishops with diplomatic missions, supported Nestorian teaching, and encouraged learning at institutions such as the School of Nisibis and the intellectual center of Junde Sabur. One of the most prominent figures was Barsauma, who vigorously advanced the Nestorian cause, founded new schools, and played a major political role, even though his opposition to the Catholicos created deep divisions. Generally, Nestorian Christians enjoyed a favorable position under Persian rule, though occasional setbacks occurred, such as Cosro I's hostility toward Catholicos Mar Abba, or renewed suspicion during wars with Byzantium. Nonetheless, the alliance between the Sassanian monarchy and the Nestorian Church endured. In fact, their greatest difficulties often came not from the state, but from conflicts with other Christian groups. When the Arab conquest came, Persian Christians did not resist, and some even welcomed the new rulers, perhaps feeling a natural affinity with Arab Christian tribes who shared their faith. In Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, various Christian-influenced sects were in conflict with what was later called Orthodox Christianity. Among them were the followers of Bardason, the Marcionites, and different Gnostic groups, including the Elkasites, a community with Judaizing Christian tendencies. Mani, born in Babylonia in 216, was raised within the Elkasite tradition from the age of 4 until he began receiving his own revelations. Around 240, he first appeared publicly, mostly outside the main centers of Sassanian power, though he remained active in his homeland as well. He taught in India and in border areas of Upper Mesopotamia. When Shapur came to power, Mani, encouraged by the hope of greater religious tolerance under the new monarch, sought his presence at court, probably with the backing of Shapur's brother Peroz. There, he gained royal protection and the freedom to pursue his mission, traveling with safe conducts and gathering disciples. Although Shapur showed interest in his teachings, Mani never succeeded in converting the king, and the distance between them remained considerable. Nevertheless, Mani sent missionaries beyond Persia early on, and already in the 240s, his envoys carried his message into Roman territory, where it spread to Egypt and Palmyra. This expansion was not a political scheme to undermine Rome, but part of Mani's vision of a universal religion. Under Shapur's son Hormizd, Mani continued his work without obstruction, dedicating to Shapur his book known as the Paburagan. Yet when Bahram I ascended the throne, the situation changed. Mani was summoned to the royal court at Jundaisabur, imprisoned, and died there. Whether Zoroastrian priests played the decisive role in his death, as Manichaean sources claim, cannot be confirmed. These same sources suggest that the wide-scale persecutions recorded in inscriptions by the priest Kirdir only began some years later, not immediately after Mani's execution. For the Manichaean community, tolerance lasted until the later years of Bahram II, when Marsisin, Mani's immediate successor, was executed, and many followers fled westward to Roman lands, to Arabia, and eastward along the routes where Mani had already established missions. A brief respite came under King Narseh, who, persuaded by the healer Aeneas and the Arab ruler of Hira, adopted a more lenient stance. But the persecutions resumed under Hormizd II, and the movement's later history in Mesopotamia and Persia remains only partly understood. Christian writings of the period alternately portrayed Manichaeans as both informants against Christians and fellow victims of royal crackdowns, while in later times confusion often arose between Manichaeans and the socially radical Mazdakites. Even during Mani's lifetime, his disciple Mar Ammo had successfully carried the faith into eastern Iran. From there, it spread along the Silk Road into Central Asia and reached as far as China. In these regions, the religion adapted to contact with Buddhism, especially in the Tarim Basin, where its writings adopted Buddhist terms. Eventually, Manichaeism was declared the official religion of the Uyghur state in the 8th century and remained influential there for generations. Its communities flourished particularly along the Silk Road, producing texts and artworks, with strong centers at Turfan and, in adapted forms, in southern China. Mani himself articulated the distinctive features of his faith. He declared his religion superior to earlier traditions in 10 ways, emphasizing above all its universality across lands and languages, its reliance on written scriptures to preserve its purity, and its role as a final path for souls unfulfilled in other creeds. He insisted that his revelation of the two principles of light and darkness, together with his writings and teachings, surpassed those of earlier prophets. He envisioned his church as an enduring structure with leaders, teachers, bishops, and an organized clergy, modeled deliberately on Christian institutions, but designed to avoid the decline he saw in earlier religions. The appeal of Manichaeism lay not only in this organization, but also in its theology. It explained the presence of evil in the world through the mixture of light and darkness, and offered salvation by recognizing this duality and aiding in the release of divine light from matter. The religion divided its adherents into two groups: the elect, who lived ascetic lives in monastic-style communities and dedicated themselves to purifying light particles, and the hearers, ordinary believers who supported the elect materially and were promised eventual spiritual progress. This structured promise of redemption, combined with its sweeping universal vision and criticism of rival religions, made Manichaeism one of the few truly international religions of antiquity, one that endured across centuries despite repeated attempts to suppress it. By the 5th century, another rival to Zoroastrian orthodoxy emerged in the form of Mazdakism. Sources describe the Mazdakites as teaching communal ownership of wealth and women, the redistribution of property, and a radical break with established family and social structures. Texts preserved in the Zoroastrian Denkard accuse them of disregarding religious trials, corrupting social order, and practicing licentiousness. However exaggerated these accounts may be, Mazdakism arose during a time of deep social crisis in Persia, after devastating wars and famines, when discontented peasants rebelled against the aristocracy and seized their property. Like Manichaeism before it, Mazdakism presented itself as both a spiritual doctrine and a social movement, threatening the established order of the empire. The rise of Mazdak and his followers was closely linked to the social ideas he promoted, which at one stage even received the temporary support of King Kavad. Yet Mazdak's life, his intentions, and the deeper inspiration of his teaching remain controversial, both in ancient accounts and in modern scholarship. Much of the debate centers on how his movement related to the wider community of Mazdakites, to the popular uprisings that erupted in the countryside, and to the difference between Mazdak's declared goals and the outcomes of the rebellions. The difficulty lies in the fact that almost all surviving testimony about him comes from religious and political opponents, particularly Cosro I and the Zoroastrian establishment, who emerged as victors in those conflicts and thus shaped the tradition. Within this context, passages from the Denkard are especially valuable, since they list the original social objectives of the Mazdakite doctrine more clearly than the Arabic and Persian narratives that are usually quoted, even while condemning them. Notably, these texts do not directly associate the Mazdakites with plundering aristocratic storehouses or abducting women, which suggests a difference between Mazdak's intentions and the actions of both rebels and nobles, and supports the view that Mazdak himself did not lead the uprisings. The Zoroastrian critics described the Mazdakites as caring above all for their own people, which seems to mean they were willing to share both property and women within extended community groups. To outsiders, this looked like an unjust form of collective selfishness. They also practiced communal distribution of food, keeping only what was necessary for survival and giving the rest to fellow members in need. The issue that most troubled their opponents was the sharing of women, which clashed with the patriarchal ideal of certain male lineage and family continuity. Such practices implied the recognition of maternal descent and communal responsibility for children, ideas that were deeply unsettling to those who valued inheritance and authority through the male household. It is less clear what was meant by the accusation of acquiring women, whether this involved exchanges within the sect or dealings with outsiders. Their rejection of ordeals and ritual vows, key features of Zoroastrian law, also signaled resistance to what they saw as hollow traditions. Overall, these criticisms reflect the internal regulations of Mazdakite communities. Whether Mazdak himself, or only certain groups of his followers, intended to extend these practices to the wider society as a challenge to the wealthy, remains uncertain. The teaching of Mazdak was not limited to social reforms. It rested on an elaborate theological system, often described as Gnostic and syncretic. Nor did the movement vanish after the suppression of the revolts and the persecutions that followed. In altered form and often underground, Mazdakite beliefs survived not only the fall of the Sassanian Empire, but also the pressures of early Islamic rule. The question of how Sassanian kings and priests treated Christians, Manichaeans, and Mazdakites leads us to the larger problem of religious policy in late antique Iran. Textbooks often portray the empire as dominated by a revived Zoroastrianism that was politically supported by the monarchy and enforced by a strong clerical hierarchy. This picture suggests a tightly organized state religion or state church in which the throne and altar worked hand in hand, producing a state both severe and uncompromising in its approach to minority faiths. In this view, persecution of Christians, Jews, and others seems like the norm rather than an occasional response to particular circumstances. Such an image, however, is too simple. Zoroastrian and later Persian sources do describe a close union of kingship and religion, presenting them as inseparable supports of the empire. Tradition claimed that Ardashir, the dynasty's founder, instructed his son, Shapur, that religion and kingship were like brothers. One provided the foundation, the other its protection. Later writings, such as the Letter of Tanzar and the Testament of Ardashir, repeated this idea, sometimes even giving religion primacy over royal power. These texts have led some scholars to conclude that Zoroastrianism functioned as an official state religion from the 3rd century onward, perhaps even serving as a model later imitated by the Roman Empire. Yet the sources themselves are late and idealized, and they often reflect a vision of perfect harmony rather than historical reality. Conflicts between kings and priests, mentioned in contemporary records, show that the balance was never so simple. The highly structured religious hierarchy described in later traditions developed gradually and mirrored the growth of monarchical authority, rather than existing fully formed in the early empire. For this reason, the labels of state religion and state church are misleading. Instead of viewing Sassanian policy as static or uniformly oppressive, it is more accurate to see it as shifting according to the personality and aims of individual rulers, the interests of the clergy, the position of minority groups, and the pressures of both internal and foreign politics. A better comparison can be found in the Roman Empire, where attitudes toward Christians and Manichaeans varied widely depending on the emperor, the needs of the state, and the way each religious group positioned itself. In both East and West, the relationship between rulers and religious minorities was shaped by a complex interplay of belief, politics, and circumstance, rather than by a rigid system of permanent persecution. During the Sassanian period, the history of Christians, Manichaeans, and Mazdakites cannot be understood only through religious disputes, but also through the wider context of political circumstances at home and abroad. The kings often emphasized their devotion to Zoroastrian gods and promoted the rituals of the faith. Yet this did not mean they were seeking to build a formal state church or to elevate the clergy to a position of equal authority. Their approach was largely pragmatic. Questions of loyalty and stability outweighed strict religious uniformity. For example, Shapur I deported Christians from Antioch, not out of hostility, but because he valued their skills and believed they would prove loyal, given their persecution in the Roman Empire. Similarly, Narse ended Kirdir's persecutions because Christian and Manichaean groups facing Roman oppression were seen as reliable subjects rather than dangerous elements. The role of the clergy in politics was far from constant. Under rulers like Ardashir I, Shapur I, and Hormizd I, the priesthood does not appear to have held independent power, and under Bahram I and Narse, it remained limited. However, during the reigns of Bahram II, Hormizd II, and Shapur II, their influence grew significantly. Kirdir's prominence was rooted in his personal abilities and persuasive ideas, while the persecutions of Manichaeans during Hormizd II's rule were likely linked to priestly influence. Yet in every case, the real drivers were political crises. Bahram II was weakened by civil war and defeats against Rome, forcing him into closer cooperation with both aristocrats and priests. Hormizd II, trying to overturn an unfavorable peace treaty, faced difficulties at home as well. Shapur II, who rose to power after fierce disputes, inherited his father's foreign policy goals, but now had to confront Christians not as victims of Roman persecution, but as allies of Rome. His persecution of them required priestly cooperation, as Zoroastrian clergy served as both religious and legal authorities. In these situations, the motivations of king and clergy often aligned, but they were not the same. For the king, persecution was political, a means of ensuring loyalty, while for the priests it was rooted in faith. It was the monarch, however, who set the tone, initiating or halting persecutions, demanding loyalty through sacrifices, and restraining excesses when they threatened state interests. By the late 5th century, Christians had become less of a challenge, especially after splitting from other Christian traditions, which allowed rulers to use their skills for the benefit of the state. Responses to the Mazdakite movement were likewise pragmatic. Kavad supported their reforms in the hope of easing social tensions and strengthening his position against the aristocracy, while Anushirvan turned the unrest to his advantage by reshaping the state's institutions. The clergy, meanwhile, functioned both as legal and religious authorities and as rivals to other faiths. The proximity of Zoroastrian, Manichaean, and Mazdakite teachings made their clashes particularly intense. Mani's claim to perfect Zarathustra's message, his universal vision, and the limited success of Zoroastrian missions beyond Iran made the Manichaeans a direct target for Kirdir and the priesthood. They used their influence under Bahram II to persecute the Manichaean elect and followers, though this policy ultimately proved only partially effective. Narse reversed course, adopting tolerance partly to weaken the clergy's growing power and partly because Roman hostility toward Manichaeans made them useful allies. Shapur I, known for his openness to new ideas, had once considered the potential of a universal doctrine to unify the empire, but he ultimately found the benefits too small to outweigh the risks. In the end, the Sassanian religious landscape was far more complex than the notion of a fixed state religion suggests. The king's policies were shaped by personal belief, but even more by shifting political needs at home and abroad. Conflict between the Zoroastrian clergy, who equated their religion with Iranian identity, and the universalist claims of Christians and Manichaeans remained central. Traditionally seen as a battle between followers of revealed scripture and guardians of an oral salvation doctrine, this struggle was experienced by contemporaries as a confrontation between Christians and Manichaeans on one side, and Zoroastrian priests, the Mogs, Mobads, and Urbeds on the other. The state and priesthood did not always act in unison, and the endurance of these minority religions, often strengthened by the memory of martyrdom, can be compared with similar developments in the Roman world. Despite sharing the same minority status within the Sassanian Empire, Christians and Manichaeans viewed one another as rivals. To Christians, Mani and his followers were as much arch-heretics as they were to Kirdir and the Zoroastrian priesthood, and they did everything possible to hinder the Manichaean mission. The Manichaeans, in turn, tried to undermine Christians by assisting the authorities in locating and punishing those they branded as traitors. The Jews of the empire followed a similar trajectory. Their communities in Mesopotamia were not as prominent in shaping Iranian history as the Christians, Manichaeans, or Mazdakites. Yet their experience reflected the same pattern. Under Ardashir, they initially faced a short period of uncertainty and repression, largely due to the dynasty change and the close ties they had enjoyed with the former Parthian rulers. However, Shapur I reached an understanding with Jewish leaders, such as the exiliarchs and rabbis, granting them greater freedom of movement in exchange for compliance with taxation and legal obligations. Shapur's hostility toward Odenthus of Palmyra, who had destroyed the Jewish center at Nehardea during his invasion of Babylonia, may even have strengthened relations between the king and his Jewish subjects. Although Kirdir boasted of persecutions, Jewish records remain silent on such matters until the 5th century. During the wars between Rome and Shapur II, the Jews remained largely loyal to the Sassanian state, unlike the Christians, apart from a few messianic groups that broke from this pattern. Later repressions under Yazdgerd II and Peroz were not driven by religious intolerance, but by political tension. Many Jews anticipated the coming of the Messiah at the 400th anniversary of the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, and uprisings linked to this belief, including attacks on the Magi in Isfahan, provoked harsh responses from the state. Other revolts, such as the one that followed Bahram II's failed bid for the throne, and a messianic uprising in Babylonia in 640, were likewise suppressed with severity. At the dawn of the 7th century, the Jewish communities eagerly awaited the Sassanian campaigns against Byzantium and welcomed the capture of Jerusalem with joy. When the Arab conquest eventually replaced Sassanian rule, the new authorities found an intact system of Jewish self-government, which gained even greater importance under the caliphs. During the Sassanian era, this system was headed by the exiliarch, a powerful political figure and wealthy landowner who often clashed with the rabbinical elite. The rabbis had firmly established the Palestinian interpretation of Torah traditions in Babylonia and promoted it as the foundation of religious education. They were generally successful, but opposition movements within the Jewish population often resisted rabbinical authority, just as others challenged the dominance of the exiliarch. Within the rabbinical schools at Sura, Pumbedita, and Nehardea, the study and commentary of the Mishnah advanced steadily, and culminated in the creation of the Babylonian Talmud between the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Although the number of Jews in the Sassanian Empire cannot be precisely measured, their population in Babylonia was significant. Most worked in agriculture, while others engaged in crafts and trade. They lived both in villages and in cities, alongside many other ethnic and religious groups, without forming closed ghettos. Social and economic divisions within the Jewish community were pronounced, with wealthy landowners shaping the life of rural settlements. Relations with the Zoroastrians were less tense than those between Zoroastrians and Manichaeans, but their rivalry with Christians was much sharper. Christian martyrologies often portrayed Jews in a hostile light, and several writings of Eastern Christian thinkers carry strong anti-Jewish tones. Amid these religious and political dynamics, the reign of Khosrow Anushirvan attracted particular admiration. Many praised him as a ruler deeply engaged with philosophy and learning, claiming he had Greek works translated into Persian and mastered texts such as those of Aristotle and Plato. Byzantine historians, however, often looked upon this acclaim with suspicion. Agathias, for example, accused Persian and even Roman admirers of exaggeration, questioning whether the king truly possessed the philosophical depth attributed to him. Yet even critics acknowledged his devotion to scholarship. In his own writings, Khosrow declared that kings must not shun knowledge, for learning and the pursuit of truth are the highest ornaments of a ruler. Evidence shows that Khosrow actively fostered higher learning. When Neoplatonic philosophers were forced to leave Athens after the closure of their school, he offered them protection and ensured their safe return to their homeland by securing amnesty for them during peace negotiations with Byzantium. Accounts describe him as a curious and skeptical learner, eager to engage with foreign knowledge. At his court, debates were held on cosmology, the nature of God, matter, and the elements, where Magi, Christians, and other thinkers presented their views, and the king himself participated thoughtfully. Among his teachers were prominent Christian intellectuals, including Moar Barsauma, Bishop of Carda, and Paulus the Persian, who composed a Syriac introduction to logic for the king. This work, based on Aristotle and Porphyry, praised Khosrow as a ruler in whom philosophy itself seemed to reside. Syrian Christians in particular played a key role in transmitting Greek knowledge to Persia, and under Khosrow, this cultural exchange reached a new height. Khosrow's engagement with the intellectual traditions of the East is most clearly seen in his decision to commission a translation of the Indian collection of fables known as the Panchatantra. The work, brought from India by the physician Burzoi, was intended to instruct rulers in the art of governance, human psychology, and strategic thinking. Its lessons have been described as promoting cleverness and even political shrewdness. The Middle Persian version of the text has not survived, but it was the basis for an 8th century Arabic translation by Ibn al-Muqaffa, published under the title Kalila wa Dimana. This adaptation, framed around the dialogues of two jackals, became immensely popular in the Near East and was later translated into numerous European languages, inspiring works such as La Fontaine's Fables. Khosrow's curiosity extended beyond philosophy and statecraft to include law and medicine. In his writings, he expressed interest in both Roman and Indian legal traditions, and his reign produced reforms that were later recorded in the Book of 1,000 Judgments. Evidence from this period also shows an openness to foreign legal thought, such as the Christian Syriac law book that emerged in his time. Medicine enjoyed particular prestige under Khosrow and his successors. In the 20th year of Cosro II's reign, a symposium of physicians was convened at Yundaysabur in Khuzestan, with leading doctors such as Jibril Durustabad presiding. The proceedings of this assembly, which brought together Christian physicians, including men named Gabriel and John, reveal the high level of medical knowledge that flourished there. This standard continued well into the early Islamic period, when the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur summoned physicians from Jundaysabur to Baghdad. The city of Jundaysabur had long been a center of learning. Some traditions link its medical reputation to the deportations carried out by Shapur Fans, while others claim that medicine was introduced through the family of Shapur's Roman bride. Whatever the origins, the reliable testimony of later historians leaves little doubt that it became a hub of scientific and medical thought, where Nestorian Christians in particular played a vital role. The Sassanian kings actively encouraged such activity, not only for practical reasons, but also because medicine was closely associated with philosophy and astrology. Burzoi himself, a physician from Nishapur, contributed to this intellectual exchange, and some sources even credit Cosro with compiling a medical book from Greek and Indian sources. Through such efforts, medical and scientific texts from both East and West, including Ptolemy's Almagest and Roman agricultural treatises, entered the Persian and later Arabic tradition. The later Sassanian era was thus a time of rich literary activity. By then, the Avesta had already been written down in a specialized script, and historical chronicles of Iran were being compiled into authoritative versions. Didactic writings, or andars, also circulated widely. Under Cosro I, literary patronage reached a peak. The chief priest Ve Shabuhar is said to have published the 21 Nasks of the Avesta, while the royal chronicle known as the Zvade Namag took shape in its earliest form. Collections of Andar's literature multiplied, and some were even attributed to Cosro and his circle. Alongside this intellectual flourishing, the court also cultivated a distinctive aristocratic culture. The Ardashir Romance, a narrative composed in the late Sassanian period, reflects courtly ideals by projecting them back onto the dynasty's founder. It describes the young Ardashir excelling at hunting, polo, chess, and backgammon, games that symbolized noble education and discipline. Hunting, in particular, was regarded as the royal sport, combining martial training with leisure. Literature of the period, such as Cosro and his page, praised not only martial skill, but also knowledge of music, fine cuisine, astronomy, and elegant manners, reflecting a broad conception of aristocratic refinement. This love of display also shaped the image of the monarchy. Byzantine observers noted the impressive titles of Sassanian kings, the immense crown of Cosro II, and the famous carpet of spring that decorated his winter palace. Yet this grandeur was not accompanied by restraint in warfare or politics. Accounts of conquest and rebellion record massacres, plunder, and the abuse of captives, including women and children.